Hello, ladies and lords. My name is Miriam Yvette, the author of The Secondborn, the audiobook you're about to listen to. This book follows a journey through the side characters of the main series, Dragon of Mirrors. The story will end in a cliffhanger to anticipate Book 1, The Hunted Prince. Please contact me if you find my audiobook on another platform, as nobody has permission to distribute this except through my channel, Miriam Yvette. Thank you for finding me in this world of the interweb. Please subscribe so you don't miss any updates. With that said, step into the portal and welcome to the world of Altendria.
The Secondborn by Miriam Yvette. Narrated by Matthew Taylor. Chapter 1. And then there was 2. Bora rubbed her eyes while resisting the release of a long yawn. A dead silent night blanketed the palace, and the halls looked grey. Since Queen Sarita had started experiencing strong contractions, no one in the slave quarters was allowed to leave their rooms. But Bora was the exception. Having been born to a small village, she begged her father of what the world outside of their tiny island was like, and he filled her curious mind with stories. In one of them, he said all the kingdoms in Altendria, be it humans, dwarves, or elves, its citizens would eat and drink themselves merry when a queen was in labour. Townspeople would light bonfires through the night, and food and drinks would continue to be served until a royal child was born. Bora gaped at the cold, empty stone halls. To her disappointment, such a celebration and cheer were nowhere inside or outside the palace. Perhaps Queen Sarita's popularity had fallen, that her people couldn't give a damn. Just outside the chamber, a knight stood watch, guarding the queen's privacy while her moans echoed out. Before Bora dared to get closer, she looked at the stone plates she was sent to fetch. The rectangular shape had a curve, perfect for roofing a house, but too thin to last a year. Another set of slabs. The knight's voice sent a chill down her spine. She was a woman, covered in plated steel. Her helmet dropped, so she could look at her through the visor. She must be having an arduous labour. Bora held her gaze at her feet and answered with a soft yes. Then you best not keep Her Majesty waiting. Bora gave the chamber door a gentle knock. Within seconds the doors opened, where a handmaiden's peering gaze struck her. Red replaced her brown eyes until she looked at the slab she held. The handmaiden widened the door without a word. Bora entered and hurried to the bedchamber, where a physician and 2 midwives assured the moaning queen. The chamber was grand and high. Everything Queen Sarita needed to ensure a safe delivery was there. Clean towels, herbs, scented oils, warm water, and now the slabs. In the corner, 5 High Court maidens sat on the plush seats, watching the handmaidens fan the panting queen who had not progressed in her labour. Bora presented the plates of stone to the royal physician. When it went between Queen Sarita's lips, she clamped against the slab. It could shave the enamel indenting of teeth, but not against the sharp fangs of a Denoni. Having worked at the palace since being stripped from her village, Bora knew the queen long waited for this day. Through whispers and eavesdropping on the court maidens, she was aware of her jealousy of every noblewoman that visited King Yosel. No matter how much she begged for the pain to go away, the queen's harrowing moans endured. Bora shared no sympathy for the queen, not when her opinion of humans was fueled with bottomless hate. Just last week, a field worker was heard calling his Denoni master a vampire, and when the news reached one of Queen Sarita's High Court maidens, they killed him for blasphemy. Bora couldn't understand why Denonis took offence, why they didn't like the word vampire. Queen Sarita slammed her fists against the mattress and spat the slabs out. From her growl, she could not endure another moment. In the split of a second, her sandy-coloured eyes darkened to red. Bora took a few safe steps back, knowing very well a red-eyed Denoni was not a good sign. A narrow mist rose from underneath her bed. Like a snake, the tip crawled and expanded, with frost layering the ground. Bora took another step back, fearing she would slip, or worse, become the target for the Queen's ice elemental. The handmaidens pressed their lips tight as they struggled in keeping their ladies' knees apart. Suddenly, the royal physician's chilly hands squeezed Bora's shoulder. He discovered she vegetated by the growing ice and moved her to the end of the bed. "Steady the sheet," he said. "I need to take a look." Queen Sarita snapped with a curse. "If something is wrong, I will snap everyone's neck." Her elemental persisted, dropping the temperature beyond average, leaving everyone to see their breaths. "Fear not, your majesty, the head is surfacing," said the royal physician. Queen Sarita's eyes flickered into a haughty red hue. "I do not harbour fear." The handmaidens grunted from steadying her legs, their heads bobbed by her strength. Bora held the sheet with one hand and used the other to help stabilise the Queen's thighs. She almost pulled back. The Queen's skin was ice cold, like death's touch to a corpse. "Don't touch me, slave," the Queen emitted another growl, "or I'll feed off you right now." Before she said another word, Bora witnessed the muscles in her abdomen squeezed. Queen Sarita yelped and hung her neck. "It's coming!" The steps of her high court maidens drew closer. Excitement sculpted their faces. "At long last," one of them said. "The nobles should be embarrassed," another said. "You have shown them that the people of Weston are strong, and they needed no royal blood to carry His Majesty's heir." "Breathe," the royal physician instructed. "Breathe and push." The Queen wailed instead. Her fingernails became dark until claws grew out of her cuticles. Like a hunting knife against an animal, they split the cotton fibres of her mattress. Bora watched as the head of the baby surfaced, moist and slimy from the womb. It was too early to tell if the baby took after Queen Sarita's dirty blonde hair or King Yosel's rustic red hair. "Very good. Once more." The royal physician steadied the head between his hands. "This is the last push." A wave of panic tightened Bora's chest. Soon she would no longer spend another year cooking in the kitchen, another dawn walking the long palace halls, replacing the dry and brittle pale flowers with fresh ones. But why did Queen Sarita choose her? She never uttered the word vampire, nor was she ever reprimanded for her work. Bora blinked at the bloody and slippery body that wiggled out of the birth canal. The babe's arms bounced towards the air, as if surprised to feel the outside world. The face scrunched tightly, displaying what could be immediate regret. Queen Sarita's glowing red eyes faded back to her light sandy shade. Just as her head landed back on her pillow, the ice she invited broke. The fireplace no longer had to fight against the Queen's elemental and rewarmed the room. "Sir," the midwife bowed as she presented a knife to the royal physician. The handle was adorned with tiny fish-looking scales. From the way it was displayed on the silver tray, perhaps it cut the cords of the prince and princesses of Talonark for generations. Before the royal physician could hover the knife over the umbilical cord, Queen Sarita shakingly lifted her head. "Let me cut it." "Your Majesty, you must rest," he said. "Rest?" she said in a dazed stare. "I have done what no queen before me could accomplish. This is my right." The High Court's maidens steadied her arms. A smile creased the corners of the Queen's lips when she took a clear view of her newborn. A future prince. From the way she leaned, her abdomen remained strangely swollen. After the cut, her exhaustion led her to fall back. The royal physician handed the prince to the midwife and went back to tend the Queen. The midwife covered the babe with a warm, soft cloth, unable to ease the newborn's wailing. Every life born into the world cried, but something was unsettling about the prince's behaviour. his tiny index finger uncurled and pointed at the birth canal. Bora looked at the rest to see if they noticed it. It couldn't be a coincidence that it remained steady, but neither the Queen nor the royal physician saw it. The finger didn't move until the midwife turned and left the chamber. Bora followed the royal physician's instructions and went to take the boiling water out of the fire. As she started pouring it into a ceramic bowl, she listened as one of the High Court maidens congratulated the Queen. The golden ornaments in her hair were unmistakably noticeable. They were the same women who woke her from her sleep and summoned her to the Queen's chamber. She knew what they requested was done in secret, otherwise they would have brought along a guard to escort them to the slave quarters. "Your Majesty, shall I inform the King of the good news?" one maiden said. "Yes, tell him I've finished," she wheezed. "A prince bearing Nari's blessing has been born." A wail brought Bora to drop the bowl. It shattered against the ground. The hot water splashed on her feet and brought her to yelp. The Queen roared as she gripped the arms of her High Court maidens. Instead of another cold mist, ice encased the legs of the bed. "It's time to deliver the placenta." The royal physician didn't seem concerned. "Give me gentle and steady pushes." Queen Sarita arched her back against the pillow and howled at the wall, bringing her shuddering High Court maidens to assure her everything was all right. Suddenly, the royal physician stepped back. His eyes widened at what he saw between the Queen's legs. "Something is wrong," one of the High Court maidens said, directing her attention to a handmaiden. "Have a look." With a quick bow, the handmaiden leaned over and looked between the Queen's legs. Her eyes froze until her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, her lips quivering slowly, crawling back. "What is it?" said Queen Sarita. The handmaiden could still not utter a word. "Tell me." The Queen's glowing red eyes returned. The ice that covered her bed shot out and covered the handmaiden, coating her to death. The panicked royal physician almost slipped from the mess Bora made. He grabbed her arm and pushed her towards the Queen's shaking legs. "Jack her!" he stammered. Hoping to redeem the Queen's view of her and not have her blood poured into a goblet, Bora held the stiff knees apart and leaned towards the space between her thighs. "I see another head making its way out." "What did you say?" moaned the Queen. "No, no, it cannot be." Bora started to recognise why the royal physician and handmaiden could not deliver the news. She had heard it often from pregnant Denoni women on the market streets. In poems or unknown discoveries, rare things were cherished or sold at top price, but not Denoni twins. For there to be twins, it meant the prince's soul divided itself, producing identical twins. "I need help." Bora couldn't keep the knees apart on her own. The royal physician muttered to himself, and the shuddering whimpers of the High Court maidens hadn't stopped. One went as far as pressing her back against the wall. Another stuttered a prayer to the first Queen of Talonarch, asking for the Secondborn to come out dead. "Lady Savannah, don't let it happen again," she whimpered. "King Yosel works hard to keep our enemies at bay. Please, we cannot endure another 10 years of malice." Queen Sarita flashed her rage at her, bringing her to apologise. The remaining handmaidens recovered and stepped up to help. Each one held onto one leg as they had before. Bora tightened her black cloak to keep what little warmth she had. Ice had covered the walls. It froze the drapes solid and frosted the window. The Queen's ear-splitting cry sobered the fearful royal physician and moved Bora aside. He instructed her to push as he had before, this time with a shaky voice. Queen Sarita screamed, darting her eyes at what was coming out of her until she once again dropped back on her bed. The royal physician straightened his back. In his arms was another wiggling body. This one didn't fling his hands out like the first. Gravity dangled his arms, and his face did not respond a reaction to the outside world. Take him." The royal physician passed the babe to the handmaiden instead of the midwife. "Is he stillborn?" cried the queen. "Tell me he is." Bora tried to look, but the handmaiden had turned her back. The royal physician ignored the queen's pleas and looked at one of the high court maidens. "Report to the king what has happened." His eyes had sunken, as if his life had been drawn out. The maiden gave him an uneasy stare and looked back at her queen. "Now!" he shouted. Startled by his sudden tone, she gave a brief bow and left the chamber. Altendria lies in a different space, one the people of Earth could not find if they tried. Chapter 2. Omen. King Yosel sat at the seat of his throne, anticipating important news. His ancestors built his Gothic palace on the highest of the Durone Mountains. Large cut coloured glass windows and high pointed arches engraved the details with ornate decorations. From the window, the wind's current slowly carried the clouds. Dozens of high pillars lifted the ribbed vaults of his hall, echoing any steps that passed by. There, his fluttering silver bats flew in and out of the palace. The pale moon pierced through the kaleidoscopic window, lightening the plump face of one of Queen Sarita's high court maidens. The dark hues of her gown contrasted the black fabric that rose near her jawline and kept her neck upright. Still holding the ruffles of her dress, she trembled before him with a bowed head. "Speak," he said, noting her lips hadn't stopped quivering. "Your Majesty." She dropped to her knees and bows until her forehead touched the floor. "Her Majesty has given birth to a son." Her back rose as her lungs inhaled. "To our surprise, another son had been born." A cold burst of air poured through the throne room. Before the High Court maiden could blink, a sheet of ice surrounded her. Shards of ice protruded from the ground and aimed at her, but not a single one made an incision on her body. Though she squeaked, she dared not move an inch. The growl from the pit of King Yosel's stomach forced her to grip her trembling arms. Having left his seat, he stepped down with clenched fists. His fangs replaced his canine teeth. By the news she delivered, he was ready to rip out her throat. The maiden succumbed to a trembling whimper. King Yosel's robe grazed her back when he passed her. He looked at his high ceilings until one of his silver bats caught his eyes. Brushing his index finger, the flying bat steered through one of the cut windows. Their mouths clicked at the wall until a portal opened. King Yosel left the High Court maiden in her submissive state and left his palace. Because he hadn't dismissed her, she was going to stay there until he cared to remember to send her away. Outside, the faint steps behind him were not unfamiliar to his ears. His right-hand woman, Hesela, had followed him. "Why didn't you report the news to me?" he said, halting his steps. "My king," she said with a bowed head, "it is no secret the High Court maidens do not trust sending information through someone that isn't serving Her Majesty." King Yosel continued on his way, aware that she was following him to the slumbering tomb. Hesela followed, obedient to remain at his side. "Your Majesty, is there anything I can do?" "There is only one way we can stop the past." He gripped his robe, made of the long soft black fur that belonged to one of his enemies. "And I will not repeat it." "But is it wise?" Hesela gazed at the crest of a black dragon he wore on his tunic. "Nari's blessing is deemed sacred. If the news reaches the scholars, they will inform the Follow, and they will not hesitate to let the elder dragons know." "Silence," he scowled. "The sound of your voice irritates me. Leave me be." Hesela obeyed with an apology and returned to the palace. The way to the slumbering tombs was shaped like a snake, extending the view of the Winster Sea The waves scattered and collided against the sharpening rocks. King Yosel hadn't relaxed his gripped fists. With his enemies across the tundran mountains and the blasted cursed Vukvoy south of Western, his crown had taken additional weight. A secondborn, a second son. Just ahead, guided by cracked pillars, was a cave, sealed by a red light, swaying as if it were sheer drapes. Inside was the preserved body of the first queen, young and ageless in her crystal coffin. Her black robe extended past her feet and was tied by a red belt. Her gold silk robe depicted the scales of a dragon, wrapping her nicely. Her arms were crossed, and her hands rested on her shoulders. On her fingers were rings that sparkled the finest gems and stones. The valuable items on her body and that of her kin tempted many thieves. Many were non-Denoni and either inexperienced or too stupid not to see the danger. Once they crossed their red barrier, their skin was peeled from their flesh. King Yosel marvelled at his preserved ancestor. Ruby reflected from his reddish-brown eyes. Having lost his mother from childbirth, his father through crueler means, and his first wife through stillborn labour, there was no room for peace in his heart. But visiting the tomb gave him clarity, assured him that his unrest would one day be given. Sometimes he imagined his lifeless body holding a pale flower, while his people carried him to his resting place. The wind picked up until 3 figures flickered behind him. The 3 nobles who ruled the borders of Talonarch had arrived. The voyage charms that allowed them to travel for miles sparkled from being used. The enchanted brooch started to tremble. The gold metal crumbled until the red gem within scattered. As remnants of gold sparkled into the darkened sky, the men remained bowed, cloaked by the same black fur he carried on his back. King Yosel refused to guide his attention from the tomb. It was as if he was speaking to his ancestor. "Your queen gave birth to my heir, but she bore another." There was a moment of silence. Only the persisting wind breezed through and whistled through the ventilated tunnel that led to a shortcut through the mountain and back to the palace. "This cannot be," said Lord Demlo, head of the western city that oversaw Graven Spruce Forest.
"Her Majesty must be quick,"
said the oldest of the lords, Lord Esquel, and head of Ravenhill. "Is this terrible omen predicting an upcoming war?" Saying it left a bitter sensation on King Yosel's tongue. Such news would stir anxiety among his people, and worse, their adversaries from Lentry would find it an open door for vengeance. "Nual would have made us aware of any advancements," said Lord Heward of the north border of Splitton.
"Last I checked, King George's people have reported no suspicious activity,"
added Lord Demlo. Lord Esquel's tired eyes shifted to Lord Demlo. "Yet His Majesty was not wrong to call it a terrible omen. Lentry may be a great distance from our lands, but they would be quick to use the Secondborn as a means to claim our lands." The old man who served his father now bowed to him. "For the sake of Talonarch, make haste." The metal-shaped star was turned, grazing the embedded red gem where a flicker of light activated King Yosel's voyage charm. Within seconds, the whispers of the High Court maidens stopped. They bowed at him and gave him space. From her bed, the Queen tried to raise her head. Her olive skin was now as a sheet as white as his. After her second attempt, he raised his hand, stopping her from trying. His nose detected ginseng in her preserved tonics that the handmaiden carried. Then he caught an unusual scent. A human slave had been in her chamber. He searched for her in the room, certain that it was one of his palace workers. His curiosity stopped when he returned to his wife. He could snap the infant's neck and be rid of his troubles, but he could not rob the mother's right to take the life she brought into the world. Seeing her tired, he did not have to tell her what needed to be done. Meeting her sepia-coloured eyes, she nodded at him. "Give me an hour's rest, for I cannot lift a dagger," she panted. "But fear not, I will smite the Secondborn." "That is why you are my queen," he said in a softer tone. "Loyal and bounded to your duties as the mother of Talonarch." His adulation made her bring a faint smile. Before he left, the king memorized the faces of the royal physician and the high court maidens in the room. They knew a slave was here, and none of them had reported it to him. Stellar magic is cultivated by Altendria. Dwarves, Danauni, elves can wield it with ease, but only humans who are sensitives can grasp such an ability. Chapter 3. Entering the Den. Bora clasped her mouth and nose when she watched King Yosel's black boots near the bed. She thanked the stars when he did not stay long enough to discover her. Moments from hearing the door shut, a hand gripped her cloak and dragged her from underneath the queen's bed. The High Court maiden's strength shook her back to her feet. She whimpered until they told her to shut up. With an authoritative voice, Queen Sarita ordered everyone to leave, and for Bora to stay. Before the last High Court maiden left, she looked back. "That Hassler wench is gone," she reported. "Excellent," said Queen Sarita. "Shut the door." Fear jolted in every bone in Bora's body, and sweat started to accumulate. This was it. She was about to meet her maker and be reunited with her father. She didn't know how Queen Sarita was going to go about it, but there were two areas Danonis loved to feed. She rolled up her sleeve, just in case she didn't want to go for her neck. The queen watched with a solid stare. Her eyes could pierce if they were sharpened on a grindstone. "Wipe the sweat from my face," she said softly. Bora fetched a clean towel from the table. Shaking, but without the liberty to run away, she leaned over the bed and dabbed the moisture from the queen's forehead. Queen Sarita breathed in. Her narrow eyebrows squeezed against one another. "That stench," she uttered. "Humans are disgusting creatures." That instant, she gripped Bora's wrist and twisted it. A shot of pain bolted through her nerves. Bora covered her mouth to keep herself from screaming. A film of red replaced the colour in Queen Sarita's eyes. Bora hated it. She hated the obvious appearance that nothing good would happen when a Danoni resorted to their instincts. "I have found a better use for you, and you must do it swiftly," she growled. "You will kill the cursed child, and don't even think of telling another soul." My queen," Bora wailed. Was her status as a slave not enough that she had to hurt her? Was taking her life not enough? "I can't bear to look at him," Queen Sarita spat while steadying the grip. "The mere sight of him disgusts me. You will raise my royal dagger and slit his little throat like a hog who knew better than to cross our lands." The hate in her eyes was stronger than her weakened state and beyond her thirst for blood. The twist turned, pulling Bora's tendons to their limit. She agreed, only to relieve herself of the pain. With a quick release, the queen rested back on the pillow. "The Secondborn's arrival has been a humiliation." Her sandy eyes stared at the ceiling. "By the grace of the king, if I do not do his bidding, he will dethrone me like the others." A low growl gargled her throat. "I am fit to be the queen of Talonarch, and no one else will replace me." Her canine teeth grew into fangs, and her eyes turned red. "Go!" Bora sped from the room on the side of the queen's chamber. Spears decorated the wall. A robust shield was at the centre, decorated in red and silver metals. A table facing the arched window had an open chest where the dagger was laid across. The blade was stained black. The handle was gold. Diamonds glimmered on the edges. By the weight, it was heavier than it looked. She wondered why the Queen needed this dagger in particular. Sure, Danone had tough skin, but what did she plan to do with the infant afterwards? Bora left with the decorative weapon, shakingly aware of what she had been tasked with. If she resisted, the dungeon below the palace awaited. That fear led Bora back to the Queen's bed, where she presented the dagger. If they took him anywhere, it would be in my laundry washroom. No other place would be better fitting. Do not bring me the body when you finish, instructed the Queen. The blood of the blade alone will do. Bora bowed and hurried out of the chamber. She sped down the hall, her heart jolted at her predicament, at the command she had been given. The laundry room was vacant. Delicate silk was laid to dry on the table. The handmaiden who took the second-born left him on the table free from fine clothing, unwashed and with no blanket to cover his body. Queen Sarita was right. Even they knew the prince deserved no accommodation. She approached the table, a bit startled by how quiet it was. The second-born did not cry. He laid there, with his tiny eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Thinking he was already dead, she brushed her fingertips against his soft forehead. The sensation brought him to squeeze his eyes shut. His shoulders raised to his neck, and his head shifted. Sensing someone was there, he began to cry. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. She guessed her warm hands had caused it. The Danone's skin was only warm to those they trusted. The handmaiden who carried him to the laundry room must have felt like an iceberg. "They have pinned you and me against one another." Her index finger traced his temple and down to his cheek. Before she pulled away, his tiny fingers grasped it. For a moment, Bora held her breath, wishing he would release. She gulped and raised the dagger over his neck. "I'll make it quick," she muttered. "You won't feel a thing, I promise." Bora shut her eyes and imagined she was going to slit the throat of a chicken. She raised the newborn's chin and steadied the blade. She could do this. She had to. Every second that went by, she told herself she could do it. The touch of metal pressed against her wrist, slowly guiding the blade away. "How very human of you." Bora flashed her eyes open. The knight who stood outside the Queen's chamber had witnessed her act. She unsnapped the brace on her plated helmet and took it off. Strawberry blonde hair fell over her chest armour. The corner of her blue eyes wrinkled when she smiled. Bora dropped her dagger. It was Hassela, the king's right-hand woman. "Or perhaps you are virtuous." Hassela looked at the dagger before drawing her gaze back to her. "You're hesitating, and even offering compassionate words to the child of your enemy." Bora almost choked for lacking no response. Hassela was disguised as a simple knight, yet Queen Sarita's High Court maidens knew it was her. She must have cloaked her appearance because she wasn't allowed in her hall. If so, maybe she could demand that she leave before she informed the Queen of her eavesdropping. "Are you done thinking of a way out?" Hassela turned her gaze back to the babe. "Because I can offer it. One beyond the palace, beyond Talonarch, but on one occasion. Take the second-born." Bora lifted the dagger from the floor. For a slave to escape was an automatic death sentence. Frightened and confused by one of Talonarch's renowned warriors offering her freedom, she shifted the tip back to the newborn's neck. He squirmed as she held his chin up. Once again, Hassela moved it away for a second time. "Are you deaf?" she said, sniffing the air. "No, I smell it. You're afraid." Hassela walked around the table, inspecting both the babe and her. "Her Majesty is cunning, is she not? She could not give the job of slaughtering this little boy to her High Court maidens. They would lose respect for her, and worse, report her to the king." A smile curled her lips. "A slave, however, is disposable." Please, let me do my job." "What for? So you can return the dagger to Her Majesty and be the next one with the gaping neck?" Bora clung to hope that obeying meant she had proven herself, that she would be spared and allowed to return to her tiny room. She glared at the sharp end of the dagger and realigned it against the fidgeting babe. "Very well." Hassler sighed and stepped away. "Do it. If Her Majesty spares you, you'll spend the rest of your life in the palace, slaving away in the kitchen and picking pale flowers until you're an old hag. Of course, that's if King Yosel doesn't have a word with you. Your scent was in the Queen's chamber. Who knows what he will do in the morrow?" Bora pretended he was unaware, but by how Queen Sarita commented on her scent, he had to have known she was there. Her mind raced for a solution, for a way out of the spit she was in. If she left, maybe, just maybe, she could find her mother and sisters. But what if this was all a trap? "Why are you betraying your king and queen?" she asked. "Why me?" Hassler shook her head in disappointment. "I'm handing you freedom, and you repay me by prying into my business?" She crossed her arms and tapped her fingers against her armour. "Talanar cannot afford another King Yosel. His grand and might has kept this kingdom safe, but his popularity outside of the capital does not sit well. For too long, he has turned a blind eye and allowed one of the border lords to treat his people no better than you slaves. Despite having a human kingdom like Noal as his allies, he enslaved you. As for the Queen, well, none of us need to debate if he will raise the firstborn like a villain. If we spared the secondborn, perhaps our kingdom will not be so ill-fated." "You're asking for war?" If there was one thing her father never made her forget, it was how quickly a kingdom could fall from within. "If that will lead to resolution, so be it." Hassler's blue gaze narrowed. "I serve and love my king, but my homage resides in my people. The Lord I serve ensured that my life wasn't hard. They did not send children to battle, not like the ones under Lord Demlo." Hassler paused. She never said who the Border Lord was, but now Bora was made aware of it. Without withdrawing her words, she continued, "I hoped when Queen Sarita took her spot at His Majesty's side, she would end his ways, but she made it worse." "No," said Bora. A flush of heat invaded her skull. "Are you certain?" "What makes you think I would help your cause after your people killed my father?" The screams from her village pulled her tears from her eyes. Her father's cry, when he told her to run, brought her to smudge them away. "You make claims are equitable," said Hassler. "Your little village would have endured peace until Kingdom Come, but the 8 tribes were primed to claim your little island if we didn't take it. Your delicate human bones would not live long as a slave among those horned beasts." "Stop, that's enough talking," she said. "Wouldn't you want to return home, to see if the rest of your family survived, or if your beloved waited for you after all these years?" Bora's jaw weakened. She shared her story with a few workers from the kitchen, but they were her people, not Denoni. It hurt her to think they would easily throw their kinship away. "Why me?" she whispered. "I was assigned to take the boy, but seeing Queen Sarita didn't kill you, it couldn't be a better opportunity." Hassler's attention moved from the babe. "Because I'm King Yosel's right-hand woman, the one who lives at Spiral Mountain will not assist me. But perhaps he may, if a helpless maiden seeks him." Bora felt like taffy, stretched in all the wrong ways. The words of a Denoni couldn't be trusted, but she was right to say she was giving the secondborn compassion. She boiled her pain and anger towards him and steadied the blade once more. Just one cut was enough, one poke to draw the blood out. With no nipple to feed him, the prince started suckling his thumb. His hair was brittle from being unwashed, but the light, she could see his hair colour was was going to be as his father, like dark red bean paste. For a moment she thought of that awful morning. 2 years had passed, and she hadn't forgotten the knight who approached her blindside. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the dagger away and dropped it. "I'm not," she shuddered with tears in her eyes. "I'm not the queen in her whip. I take no pleasure in hurting others." Excellent choice of words. Hassler grabbed the babe and placed him in her arms. At once, her touch sent her heart racing. He was shivering, but he wasn't a moment ago. Did he perhaps know what she was going to do? "Where am I going?" she said, drawing him closer to her chest. His nose rubbed her breast as if he was searching for milk. "You will go through Graven Spruce Forest." The weight of a boulder fell in the pit of Bora's stomach. "You can't be serious. Werewolves live there." "Werewolves? Ah, humans and your little earthly names. You are not Denoni, so your scent will not agitate them. Hide the Secondborn scent with lavender. It will repel King Yosel's subjects and those beasts at the same time." Hassler looked at the doorway again. Faint steps were coming. "Are you ready?" Bora placed the shuddering infant between the layers of her dress. She tied the ends of her black cloak to keep him covered. Then she took the hood with gold stitching and covered her head. Hassler traced her fingers around her neck until she pulled a necklace hidden underneath her armour. A round golden device clanked and spun as she presented it. "A voyage charm," Bora uttered. "You didn't think you could leave the palace unnoticed, did you?" smiled Hassler, pressing the crimson gem. When it started to glow, she left it in Bora's hand. "Wait, what about the lavender?" The voyage charm trembled. Sparks of yellow spewed out of the device. Bora never imagined she would feel stellar magic on the palms of her hands. The brush of wind came, and her sight turned hazy. "Hassler," she said, "what's happening?" The hems of her cloak were tugged, but there was no one around to pull them. The wind grew loud, fluttering the bottom of her grey dress. Hassler observed without a goodbye. In her hand was another voyage charm. The red gem spun until she and the laundry room faded away. A flowery scent brought Bora to open her shut eyes. Her hand burned, and the voyage charm spasmed until the stellar's flickering gold light crumbled the device. She dusted her hands and looked at the field before her. Miles of lavender separated Graven Spruce Forest from Talonarch. Under the moon's light, tiny purple cones protruded in different directions. The chill of the night brought her to shudder and focus on Hassler's instructions. Bora tore heaps of purple flowers and stuffed them over the newborn's nakedness. Though it was not deadly, the aroma made their noses weak. The babe squirmed and sneezed until tears streamed down his cheeks. The high moon could not guide her through the darkness in the forest. The old trees towered over her like the mouth of a cave, holding no promise that she would make it. She didn't know werewolves were called Vukvois until she lived in the capital, but she knew and witnessed the beasts being most active at night. "A vampire prince pressed against my bosom," she whispered to the black forest. "The den of werewolves ahead." The mainlands make up the largest continent in Altendria, or so they say, for the backwoods are shrouded by clouds and mist. Chapter 4. Graven Spruce Forest. Bora hushed the crying babe. "We won't make it out alive if all you do is think about milk." She kept him close, not minding the humidity of their closeness. "Even if I could produce it, it would make you sick." She turned at every creaking branch and held her breath when the owls hooted. Fern carpeted the region. Moss grew wildly among the trunks of the trees and rocks. From her village, Graven Spruce Forest was visible from the fishing dock. She often spent her summers there, thinking if she ventured inside, she would find a magical kingdom of fairies. But she was wrong. So wrong. To keep herself focused, she thought of her village, the faces of her neighbours, her mother making bread, and her 2 younger sisters, teasing her whenever the boy she fancied winked at her. The settlers were made of ruined townspeople and soldiers who deserted the last lunar war. They crossed the waters and respected the werewolves' territory by never setting foot in Graven spruce forest. When she turned 15 years old, she dreamed of being wedded off by the red-headed boy who cared for the goats. But without warning, Talonarch's soldiers raided her village. She remembered the cages, the bars that drummed, when they flung those who resisted them. Those who didn't want to meet the sword lined up like animals, waiting to be slaughtered. Bora remembered the burning houses and the voice of her father, telling her sisters and mother to escape. Bora stayed behind, unable to leave her father's side, who suffered from a bad back. She remembered the sword and shield he carried, one he only showed her once, when he told her he was once a soldier of Kentin. After the Denoni knights pierced their swords through his chest, they yanked the sickle she had on hand, dragged her into one of the cages, and locked her in with the other survivors. Bora clamped her eyes shut. If that wasn't in her nightmares, her mind would draw her back to that painful night in her waking hours. Dawn swept the forest grey. The long travel rocked the babe to sleep. She used her saliva and cloak to wipe his face clear. When she wasn't looking for signs of danger, she would habitually look at him. With his eyes shut and his face calm, he was as charming to look at. The crunch of leaves brought her to stop and look at the ground. There were no leaves by or below her feet. The crunching of leaves resumed, bringing her spine straightened with a chill. Fluttering over her head was a faint screech. The sound brought the cold chill of the palace halls. She often heard them when she passed the throne room. Bats had been spying on her, and it wasn't just any flying bat. They belonged to the king.
Girl.
A man covered in plate armour with a red visor showed himself.
You need not walk any further.
At his side were 4 knights in the same black armour she had seen when they raided her village. She was no fighter, yet they gripped the handle and sauntered with uneasy steps. The leader who called on her pointed his spear directly at her, bringing her attention back to him.
You have been deceived to think we would not find you. Even the voyage charm of King Yosel's best warrior leaves a trail.
A growl echoed through his helmet.
That Hassela. Where is she? What did she tell you?
Bora looked at the Black Knights. Seeing them once again, she could no longer separate her nightmares from reality. The flames of her village, her neighbours screaming as they fled. She could almost hear her father screaming in her face. It came and came until she finally acted on it. Run, Bora. She bolted and ducked under one of the tree's raised roots and heard the sound of metal strike it. As she struggled to lift her legs forward, the movement of mail and metal came at her like a storm. The babe cried from how hard her feet pounded against the ground, how heavy she withdrew air. A tug at her cloak stopped her altogether and flung her against the trunk of a tree. She braced herself and fell on her side and elbow. As lavender scattered against the ground, the knights covered their noses.
I tried to give you a few moments of life by letting you answer my question,
the leader said, marching towards her.
But your time is up.
His spear aimed at her chest.
This is where you will rot, and that cursed Secondborn will return to be properly gutted by Queen Sarita.
Let me speak to King Yosel, she begged. There is something about the Queen he doesn't know.
It's too late to ask for time,
he said. But I have some news.
Let's get this over with,
one knight said.
We don't want to fume the forest with our presence. You heard him.
The spear was reeled back. Bora's heart thumped wildly at the blade that would enter her. The branches above suddenly bounced, bringing her and the knight to look up. A hoarse growl lingered in the shadows. The leader of the knights pressed his back against the others. Their weapons were out, aiming at what could come at them. More shadows appeared, and replaced dawn's light into the forest. The branches violently creaked by the weight. A hard thud jumped Bora, forcing her to witness the werewolf who showed himself. By his height, he could leap on the roof of a single village without effort. His spine was slightly hunched, every part of his body bulged from muscle. Tufts of black hair covered him from snout to toe. It was the same that King Yosel and the Border Lords wore as a cloak.
"Dear Noni,"
the words came in a growl.
"Since when did Talonarch find it befitting to cross our forest?" "Betrayers of Queen Savannah, heed back and let us pass," the leader of the knights said. "We have no qualms with your cursed blood tonight." "We are Vukvoy."
Darkened bodies leaped from the side, forcing the Denoni knights to counteract with their elemental. Walls of ice shot from the ground and protected them from the incoming enemy. Their claws hurled at the ice like a sledgehammer. Within seconds, a fog saturated the ground, slowly blurring the forest. Bora crept from the fight until a wiry fur brushed her cheek. Too petrified to look up, she braved the Vukvoy's ear-splitting howl. She crawled underneath his hind legs. The lavenders on her chest made his dark eyes squint. He sniffed the air, sensing she was nearby, but his massive size and stature had kept him from noticing her. With his back against her, Bora fled. She crossed a few trees and sidestepped out of her careless footing, barely missing the spear that would have taken her down. The leader of the knights left his group to pursue her with downcast eyes. A flurry of ice gathered round his open palm until it took a solid shape. The shard increased in size, and the edges became sharp. He raised it against her, but turned at the incoming beast that got too close. The ice penetrated his chest, bringing frost to spur around. The werewolf responded with a strike of his own. 6-inch claws carved his plated armour, but it didn't harm him, so he went on his fours, grabbed his legs, and dragged the leader towards the rest. Bora held the prince close and turned from the fight scene for a way out. A beast with matted hair halted her steps. She flinched when he exposed his long, sharp teeth. He snarled, ready to snap at her trembling muscles.
"Never mind her,"
barked a werewolf.
"We take the leeches first."
The matted werewolf leaped over her and joined his pack. Bora made a break for it. Behind, the clashing of armour and wild roars ensued. As she fought for air, the roof of her tongue felt like a paste for thickening soup. Her legs wobbled from the long journey, but the threat behind her fueled her to keep moving them. No matter how hard her heart pounded, how often she almost missed her step, she would continue. Fearing the Secondborn was harmed, she quickly glanced at her chest. Crammed from space, he was awake, silently staring back at her. The lavender brought a rash on his delicate skin, and his little eyes had become plump from inflammation. She didn't know why lavender gave Denoni and Vukvoys severe allergic reactions, but it certainly repelled them for her to travel this far. Down the vined hills, a fog covered a wide family of ferns that covered the ground. She caught her breath and breathed in the cool air the ferns emitted from underneath. Her cloak brushed the fronds while she wiped the sweat that streamed down her temple. High above, the morning sun sparkled and glittered among the branches. Just ahead, a blend of orange and yellow light peered through the trees. "It's a meadow," said Bora, picking up the pace. "We did it!" The end of the Graven spruce forest was just a sprint away. Behind, the howls in Graven spruce forest ate through the cries of the knights until their silence declared the victor. Bora rushed for the exit until the galloping of feet shot adrenaline through her spine. Looking over her shoulder, the matted werewolf that spared her was back. He was on all fours, hiding among the ferns, baring his teeth. His fierce blue eyes held a frightening glow. As he cautiously approached, Bora stepped back. The draught from the meadow brushed against her back. The scent of wildflowers reminded her of home. When the light touched her skin, she sped for the open field. The Vukvoy growled and began the chase. Bora screamed for help. Her plea echoed through the mountainside, but no one was around to take pity on her. Not from the sky or field of wildflowers. A hot sting carved against her skin and sent her trampling onto the ground. She clenched her teeth as a wave of pain pulsed to her head. She crawled on her fours and moaned from the strike that slit the back of her cloak and dress. Her arms gave out, and she fell sideways against the wild grass. She breathed the fresh morning air and watched the Vukvoy approach her. The squirm in her chest brought her to leave the beast's deadly eyes for the newborn. The grey colour of his newborn eyes had turned red. His Denoni instincts sensed the danger. Bora reeled him close and exposed her bloody back to the growling Vukvoy. She pressed her cheek against the babe and shut her eyes. As the werewolf snarled, the throbbing pain on her back reminded her she was still alive. Fluttering her eyes open, she discovered a cloaked man stood behind her, blocking the rising sun from piercing her pupils. On his back was a bow, and at his side a quiver and set of arrows. His sword was on hand, raised against the beast.
"I told you not to cross my fields," he said, shifting his eyes to Bora and back at the Vukvoy. "Yet here you both are, stepping on my daisies." "Hermit, keep your nose out of this." "This field is under my watch. Make your killing here, and I will slice you like my morning bread."
The Vukvoy hunched on his fours and snapped his teeth.
"You are only one man, a puny human of that matter."
"Have it your way." The hermit unsnapped his cloak. Against the light, Bora caught the spiralling red star near the hem. When it dropped, the werewolf leaped towards him. The hermit made a fast backward step, though when she blinked, he was further back. His speed was unnatural. Looking at his legs, traces of yellow light remained. The Vukvoy chased him, each time the man sped back, quicker than any man Bora had seen. His hand was in his pocket, and his brown hair ruffled from his quick movements. The Vukvoy soon stopped, seeing a great distance had been created between him and her. He left the man and charged towards her. Bora's yelp caused the newborn to cry. As he raised his claws, the man appeared before her, unveiling a round glass vial from his pocket. The content was ash, with bits of grainy particles that sparkled like diamonds. The man reeled his head back and tossed the bottle at the Vukvoy's hairy black chest. When the beast's claws missed the man's face, the vial shattered and opened a wave of fire that burned black. As it grew, Bora saw the flames stretch out, almost reaching towards her until the man dragged her from it. The Vukvoy swung his claws against the air as if to fight the fire that engulfed him. In a last attempt, he galloped towards them. Before he got too close, the hermit struck his sword against the beast's neck. Bora clenched her jaw after his head drooped. Vukvoy swayed. His muscular legs kept him standing. With one more strike, his head thudded at her feet. The snout wrinkled, and his blue eyes were still set on her. The Vukvoy's jaw opened until the same sword fell through its skull. Damn things. Pressing his foot against the snout, the hermit peeled back his sword. Stay here. He gripped the beast's wild blend of black and grey hair and marched towards Graven Spruce Forest. Wait, she called out. There's more of them. At the borderline of Graven Spruce Forest, a line of Vukvoys watched under the tree's shade. No water or sand can put out the flame that now ashens his body. There was no concern or hesitation in his voice. I have to return what is left. Bora watched with a thumping heart. The Vukvoy's head dangled from the grip the hermit held against his fur, and his blood dripped from the sword he fastened with his other hand. His approach invited the growling and snarling teeth of Vukvoys. Unlike the Talonarch knights, his leather gauntlet and brown gamson would not provide any defence. How dare you use the black flame? From the softness in her darkened voice, she was a woman, and yet Bora could not tell her apart from the men. They were all muscular humanoid wolves to her eyes. "He gave me no choice," said the hermit. "I gave him a way out, and he chose to fight. As you saw, I did not let him suffer for long, as he was not my adversary, and neither are you." The Vukvois looked at one another. There were different expressions on their faces. Some were shown clearer under the light. Among them were still hostile glares. From behind, the pack parted, allowing an even larger Vukvoi to come and observe the man who carried the head of one of their own in his grasp. Instead of a black coat, its hair was silver-white, and its eyes were green. Its presence made the others flatten their ears and backed away. There was a sudden pause. Nobody initiated an exchange of words if there would be conflict or peace. The hermit then flung the head and dropped it at their feet. Bora clutched the grass at what would come next. Without words, the hermit exposed his back and returned. Instead of keeping his sword prepared for an unexpected turn, he wiped the blood with a cloth he pulled from the pocket of his trousers. "Can you stand?" he said without glancing at her. His focus was on his blade, giving it another round against the cotton material. Bora secured the newborn to her chest, fearing he would see him. Surely he heard him cry. She heaved when she got to her knees. Her feet quivered, spent from the trekking through the forest. "My back, it stings." The hermit sheathed his sword, picked up his cloak, and shifted his brown gaze on her. "Well, I doubt werewolves are known for keeping their claws clean." He took her arm and helped her tread to the other end of the meadow. "I'll see to your wound after we make some distance. For now, we are lucky the pack let us go." "That red star on your cloak. You're a speaker, a cardinal point, are you not?" She remembered her father would draw the 4 strange shapes on the ground. Each was a symbol that represented the directions a compass depicted: north, east, south, and west. The man didn't answer her question. Bora winced when her spine slightly moved to the left or right. She had to keep it straight to avoid the discomfort. "I never met one," she continued, "but my father used to say the dragons established the cardinal points. They are noble warriors who do good deeds and serve the mainlands." Looking at the swirling red star on his cloak, half covered over one shoulder, it was just as her father said. "I never thought one of them would live in the middle of nowhere." "Speakers live where they want, or must," he said with a brief pause. After his comment, Bora felt his eyes observing her, looking at the details of her cloak. "That gold stitching on your cloak has a gloss that can only come from the silkworms of Telemark. Care to explain how you got here?" Bora evaded his stare. No, I was a slave who served King Yosel's palace." She stopped when the speaker told her to show him her back. "The first 5 years I worked the fields, the other was in the palace." She grimaced when he peeled the fabric off her dress from sticking on her open wound. "We got a few ways to go before we reach my cabin." Taking his cloak, he wrapped his arms around her and looped the front, and brought the ends to the back. When he tied it, the pressure didn't ease the ache. "You're lucky he grazed your skin and not your muscles." The whimper from her chest stopped him altogether. Bora attempted to move, but his hands grasped her shoulders, stopping her at once. He spun her to face him and stared at the wiggling movement under the fabric of her dress. He lowered her collar and raised his eyebrows. "You're carrying a Denonian doused in with lavender flakes." "If I must, I can explain." "No, you will explain," he said, releasing her. "But not here." The knot against her back was not enough. Her wound still stung. "I haven't slept, and that frightening forest blistered my feet. I need to rest, and if you have any to offer, some ointment for my wound." "Demanding, aren't we?" he said with a tired sigh. "Very well, but we should introduce ourselves. I am Luron, and you are?" "Call me Bora." "And that little twig you're carrying?" He gave the babe another look. "What's his name?" His mother never named him. The thought made her look at the prince. unnamed and unwanted. I don't believe it's befitting for a human to name a vampire of royal blood. Royal blood? Luron left her side and started guiding the way up the woods. You will tell me about it over a bowl of stew, but you really must name him. I can't give him one. Bora thought of the dagger she pressed against his frail neck. It is not my right. Then Twig will be his name. What? No! Then name him. Bora's fingers trembled when she brushed his soft forehead. The only name on her mind belonged to the red-headed boy who promised to call her his wife. When the Denoni Knights attacked her village, she didn't see him among the dead or captured. Gulping at her stolen opportunity to live a normal life, she planted her memory of him on the infant. I shall call him Rith. Saying it out loud brought her to smile. That's short for Rithian. The woods were dense, and the cabin Luron promised had not appeared. Her legs could not go on, not after her sprint and having a Vukvoy carve her back. Every minute or so, she felt her balance wobbled, as if the ground underneath wanted to trip her. She paused and caught her breath, leaning her elbows against the nearest tree. We're almost there, said the speaker. Ever since she named Rith, he kept to himself. I just need a few moments, please. He crossed his arms and leaned his back against a pine tree that carried sick brown leaves. By his voice and his serious composure, he looked older than her, but not a trace of grey was among his short brown hair. That fire, she said. I never seen one burn so black. The black flame is one of the deadliest fires that exist. You mean there are more? The red flame and the blue flame are the others. Luron started tapping his index finger against his arm. The black flame is a unique case, as it's the only fire that is created. Enchantresses have been known to use a red flame and enthrall it with their dark element. Against any living creature, it feeds off your stellar and gives it back to the caster before it does any damage. But to a Denonian Vukvoy, the black flame is their Achilles heel. It will burn and never let you go. No water or sand can stop it. Luron left the pine tree and continued. Come, we rested enough. Half-mile up the terrains was an open field, and at the centre a log cabin with a stone fireplace bulging from the back. At the entrance was a little garden patch of potatoes and carrots. The fire is already on, said Luron. I'll be back. Where are you going? To hunt, he answered, passing her. That's how I ran into you. I was checking my traps before I heard your screams. Before Bora could say another word, he marched back to the woods. The cabin was small and carried the scent of mints he hung to dry. She took off her cloak and laid it on his chair. On his table, an arrangement of materials surrounded his candlestick. One was a leather-bound journal. For an hour, Bora kept one hand close by the fire and cradled the newborn with the other. Now and then, Rith would bobble his head in search of her nipples. I told you already, I cannot feed you, she said with an irritated tone. And I'm not your mother, so don't think of me as your caretaker. Rith responded with a shrilling cry. After a long minute, his entire body was beet red, contrasting the bumpy rash the lavender gave him. It came as a short surprise to Bora. She had never seen Denoni's blush or grow red from anger. Perhaps when Rith got older, the capillaries would no longer surface to his skin and conceal his inner emotions. She patted his back and swayed him side to side, but she couldn't pacify him. She thought of the Denoni mothers at the marketplace that hummed to calm a stressed child. It was always the same slow and repetitive tune that anyone who heard it wouldn't forget. She hated that she had to do it, but she hummed their melody and rocked him side to side. Rith squinted his eyes and gave him an unpleasant frown, stopping his cry altogether. What? She said. My voice isn't that bad, is it? His eyes relaxed, and his cheeks sunk when his mouth pursed, forming a funny oval shape. Bora curled a smile, sensing a warm sensation on her chest. The feeling caught her off guard, and she frowned and looked back at the flame. The door slammed open, jolting her to retreat from the fireplace. She steered towards the bed, where the window overlooked the mountain. Her mind raced of the Denoni Knights, of their growl and ice elemental. The wind entered and agitated the fireplace.
"It's me," said Luron. "Come out and bring me a cloth from the shelf over the basin."
She recognized his voice, got the loose-knitted cloth, and went to meet him. On the wooden table was a deer. He sliced a chunk of meat and asked for the material. After he wrapped it, he squeezed to show her how to strain the blood out.
"It's not mother's milk, but it's blood."
He gave it to Bora.
"See if the twig wants it."
She hovered the fresh meat over him. At once the infant squirmed. His nose searched the air for what she knew he sensed. She pressed the cloth to his lips and gently squeezed. Rith snivelled. He gulped red until it streamed down his cheek. Bora wiped it away and looked at her hand without disgust. She witnessed worse things in Talonarch. On the streets of Rosent, they taught young ones to draw the blood of their prisoner. More so, the act was barbaric after she learned that consuming blood from different races and beasts led Denonis to have more sensitivity. Her attention adjusted back to Rith. With deer blood coursing through him, she knew he could soon memorize and detect their scent a quarter of a mile away. "What will become of him?" she said, as Luron cut a piece of meat and diced them.
"First, tell me how you escaped with the Prince of Talonarch."
He returned to the cabin, where she followed him closely. He set a cauldron by the fire and poured water to be stored in a wooden bucket.
"Well, are you going to tell me?"
Bora sat by the table and watched Luron pour the meat into the cauldron. The longer she withheld her answer, the more often he would pause and peer at her. Her father spoke fondly of speakers, their righteousness and bravery, but was trusting them the same. She could be the wretched one for taking Rith from the palace, and he could easily take her back. The water was boiling when Luron gave her another unruly stare. This time she shifted her attention at the table. Instead of the leather journal, a white cloth with blue and red embroidery caught her eyes. From the shape, it seemed to be covering bread. Fascinated by the colour, she reached for it, until Luron took her wrist.
"Your hands are dirty," he said. "You'll ruin the fabric."
She gulped by his cold command and pulled back.
"If you must know what's in it, it's seeded wheat bread from a bakery in Vistra."
"I was just admiring the cursive embroidery," she explained. "The woman who stitched it had some talent."
"How long do I need to wait before you answer my question?"
Luron poured his chopped potatoes and carrots into his stew and sprinkled dried herbs.
"Or am I not hospitable enough?"
"I'm afraid you'll send me back if I tell you." She looked at Rith. His eyes drew backward, and his eyelids were slowly dropping. She wiped his red-stained lips and set the meat aside. "But you saved me, so I owe you an explanation." Bora began with the Queen's coronation, pregnancy, moved forward to the delivery, and the King's right-hand woman, Hassela.
"I've never heard or seen Twin Denoni before."
Luron gave his soup a taste.
"And that Hassela, she knew I would be here."
Hope stirred inside Bora's chest, for the speaker showed no immediate reaction to her tale. "Will you help Rith?" If she passed him to his care, perhaps she could see Vistra for herself, buy her own bread, and start a new life.
"I don't see why that woman thought I would open my home to this twig."
Luron gave his soup one last stir and went for the wooden bowls.
"Hate to be the giver of ill news, but it won't be long before they find him."
"I can't keep him," sprang Bora. Her back ached from rising to her feet. "I agreed to bring him out of Talonarch in exchange for my freedom." She tried not to look at Rith when it came out of her. "Now I just need to leave this boy with you."
"I'm not the one who named him."
He poured his stew into the first bowl.
"What's the saying? Once you name something, you get attached?"
"You made me, and I'm not attached."
Now, I was only teasing."
He almost curved his lips when he poured the second bowl. The only thing I can offer is to present the boy to the cardinal points, for I can't decide if he's worth protecting. I'll be honest, we may have to return him to his parents."
"If you do that, Queen Sarita will kill him."
"Then you are asking them to kill me, or anyone who is under the twig's care, yourself included."
Bora drew Rith near her chest. No Denoni would give up until the infant was back in Rosant, back in the palace, and in the lethal arms of his mother. She jumped when the speaker placed a bowl of hot stew on the table. When he placed a wooden spoon beside her, she didn't wait for it to cool down. The savoury beef and boiled vegetables tasted so good under bad news. Luron left his bowl to cool. Taking the leather journal, he grabbed a travel bag that hung from the wall and buried it inside. Then he reached under his bed and dragged a chest box. He uncapped the hinged lid and brought out a steel helmet that was so polished it reflected every light in the room. Luron covered it in leather and placed it inside the bag, and did the same with an old mail and a pair of steel gloves. High on the shelf by the window, he reached for a vial that stored black sand. It was the same one he threw against the Vukvoy. He blew air against it and watched the dust it collected scatter. "Where are you going?" She was already halfway through finishing her bowl. "Nowhere I haven't told you." Luron secured the vial in his breast pocket and tied his travel bag. "I'm off." "So soon?" "Not soon enough. King Yosel will find my cabin and burn it by tonight. You should consider where you want to start your new life, and with a new name at that. I'll see to it that." He flung his cloak over and covered his side. He then approached her and opened his arms. "I'll take the twig off your hands now." Bora's heart raced and her stomach churned. Luron intended to go alone. "I can't come with you." "If you wish to follow me so I may protect you, you've fooled yourself. I am not your bodyguard." "I'm not senseless. I'm going for the boy." "So you are attached." Fueled by anger, Bora abandoned her bowl and thanked him for his hospitality. Wincing from the pain on her back, she steadied Rith to her chest and glared at Luron. "Just tell me where I can find the other speakers." The babe whimpered by her quick movements, so she patted his back to reassure him. "If only it were that easy. I was doomed to help the moment I killed that Vukvoy," said Luron. "We will see what the other speakers have to say, but I will once again embed this on your mind. That twig has a high chance of going back to his parents. You don't just kidnap a prince and think there won't be consequences." "Let's go." Bora stammered out of the cabin. She wanted no more of his pessimistic outlook. Maybe the other speakers were more compassionate. Half a day walk down the sharp slopes of Spiral Mountain, Bora dreaded another step. She was a simple village girl, and once a slave. She had no experience as an adventurer. Luron, on the other hand, would stop to scout the area from time to time. If it wasn't for the abrupt breaks, she wouldn't go on. He carried a map he said was marked free of mountain goblins, bandits, and worse things, but he didn't explain them. Whenever the rocks crumbled, he would grip the handle of his sword. "This place makes me dizzy," she said, "almost to the point of wanting to vomit." "They don't call this mountain spiral for no reason," said Luron. "The rocks here move and shift in a corkscrew motion." Bora gaped at the ground beneath her. "How can a mountain be alive?" "It's not exactly alive," said Luron. "You can't even tell it's moving, not unless you miss your step." "What in Altendria made you want to live here?" Bora turned to look at her back, where Rith was swaddled with the embroidery cloth she admired. Using a linen wrap, she carried him on her back to apply the right amount of pressure against her wound and keep her arms free. "Luron?" "That information is private." Luron paused to look at his map, then hurried ahead as if to make up for the brief stop. "But I'm not living like a hermit to pass the time." "So you're here on a mission?" "One that is none of your business." "Fine, but can you slow down?" Her calves were sore from the hike,
The soles of her feet still ached, and her back still pulsed from the werewolf's claws. She frowned when the speaker kept the same pace.
How will the others know where to meet us?
My falcon Mary visits me every day. She will see I abandoned my home and find us.
What else can you tell me of the cardinal points? Bora asked. My father said there is one speaker for each race.
Aye, said Luron. One human speaker, one elf speaker, one dwarf speaker, and one Denoni speaker.
And you serve every king?
Bora thought of her father and his life before he moved to the village. Aye. Luron stopped momentarily. Bora halted before her nose smacked his back. There was a rocky steep ahead. The Great Witch likes to call us contractors of justice. He went down first, told her to wait, and scouted for anything lurking among the trees. Seeing they were safe, he grabbed her hand and helped steady her steps. But no matter who I serve, I will be recognised as the Speaker of the East.
Brimson lands,
Bora grunted as she balanced her weight on the sharp rocks.
It sounds lovely.
It's a hellhole, answered Luron. That continent rarely sees peace. I can't express the relief I'll feel when the three kingdoms are no longer at each other's throat. She heard him release a tired sigh. Now and then I partake in their conflicts. Like any poor foot soldier, they leave us with the memory of the dead.
It must be hard. I didn't have to endure such things,
said Bora, stepping over a sharp rock that protruded.
My village was secluded and protected for a while.
There's no such thing as protection in the Brimson lands, answered Luron. I lived in the camps outside the high walls that protected the capital of Donnelly, Lionur. Many of us had to fend for ourselves and fight for any food that met the ground.
And now you're a speaker,
she concluded, baffled by his upbringing and his respected title. My former master Essie picked me to be his successor, but the choice of following him was my own. It didn't take long. It was live and starve like the orphan I was, or bear a speaker's weight and eat among many kingdoms' great halls. To a child, an empty stomach always chose the latter. The squirming of the babe stopped him and made him scowl. Hush it, Twig.
Why do you keep calling him that?
Because he looks like one, scrawny and helpless from a boot that could squash him.
He is an infant, and it's been a while since he last ate.
Bora carefully slid the wrap to the front. Bora smiled at his scrunched-up face.
Yes, you are hungry.
Through the way down the mountain, Luron hunted for any bird or squirrel they encountered. The first time he drank, the first drink quenched him for hours, but the days that followed doubled his hunger. When he was calm and had his fill, Bora would hum the tune of his people.
I bet your brother is dressed in fine silk.
She brushed the fabric she swaddled him with.
I pray this little embroidery will suffice for you, little prince.
If you keep talking to him, the harder it will be to leave him.
I told you, I'm here to ensure the boy will be safe.
Sure. As the night fell, Luron continued without a strain in his breathing. Bora panted, tired of the downhill slope and the several types of rocks that almost took her balance. The leather of her shoes was a sharp rock away from tearing open.
Speaker, she huffed, how much longer?
We haven't gone down the mountainside yet, and we're half a day away from reaching the death fields of Aroga.
Death fields, said Bora. Why would you describe a place in such a way?
She saw his surprise after her words laughed. How old are you? He asked. Most would have given me a different expression, not curiosity.
25, she answered. You?
45. He scouted the trees that surrounded them. That makes me your senior.
Hardly, she said. My mother was 50, and my father was 120 when they had me.
120? Said Luron, looking back at her in disbelief. He must have really not wanted kids. Bora drew her eyes to the ground. She didn't explain why her father had her so late in his life. She didn't blame him for being so surprised.
The villagers had teased her father for being grey-haired and having a beautiful young wife. He never minded their comments and told them he was lucky he didn't age like the humans of Earth. Many were lucky if they made it past 70. In Altendria, he told the Stella from the planet made humans age slow enough to live a few years after 200. Bora glanced back at Luron. Most of the men in her village who were his age were married and developed round bellies. The speaker was lean, and his arms slightly bulged. "Do you have a family?" she asked.
"No," he said without turning back.
"Why not?"
"They're not a necessity."
"But living near those dreadful werewolves is." She rubbed her shoulders. The strap from her travel bag and the moisture in the mountains was causing a rash.
"And you?" he said. "Since you risked your life for that twig, I'm going to assume your status as a slave kept you from having one."
"No, we are allowed to grow a family, but I was devoted to my work. How could one think to have a child around those vampires, those awful, awful monsters?" She felt great saying it without punishment.
"It's King Yosel and Queen Sarita who fuel your fear. Your freedom was stolen because of them, not the common Denoni."
"I'll admit the ones who live outside the palace have been kind to me, but that doesn't make them good. I have seen them feed those horned people to their 5-year-olds.
"Chelors?" Lauren asked. "It's a shame that Talanark and the 8 tribe will never see peace."
"Both Denoni and Chelors are monsters."
"No," corrected Luron. "You're asking why a Vukvoy doesn't curtsy. Denoni are not humans, and Chelors are their own people. Don't confuse their way of living with your moral compass."
Luron turned and smirked at Rith.
"One day that twig you're holding, and still haven't left in my care, will disappoint you. He'll sink his teeth into your house pet before he learns to walk."
"Need I remind you that I was a slave?" said Bora. "We weren't allowed to eat what we grew. It would be nothing but rations of yams and chicken." The old women who worked in the kitchen all their life taught her how to make yam syrup for the days they made bread. The aroma of rye only filled the kitchen when King Yosel had a guest, be it dwarf or human. She didn't get to see them.
"Sovereign kingdoms will remain sovereign for as long as dragon law is not broken," said Luron. "Just be glad that you escaped Talanark, and the Vukvoy didn't rip you to pieces."
The mention sent Bora back to the nights in Graven Spruce Forest. "One of King Yosel's men called the werewolves betrayers of Savannah. What did that mean?"
"Exactly what it meant," answered Luron. "Vukvoys, or werewolves as you like to call them, were once Denoni, who were cursed by Nari, the dragon."
"The black dragon that is depicted in King Yosel's garments," said Bora. "Before I worked in the palace, I used to think it was a person."
"Aye, the elder dragon Nari was the first to grant asylum to Earth's refugees. Nari took a liking to Savannah, the first queen of Talanark. Their friendship lasted through their rule until her own people betrayed her."
"What led to the curse?"
"From what I've been told, Denoni lived like anarchists on Earth, but that changed in Altendria, and Savannah's submission to the dragons made her unpopular to some. Upon hearing of her death, Nari cursed those who betrayed her, turning their instincts inside out and allowing them to become the beasts they are inside. Nari also punished those who were loyal to and could not protect the Queen by giving the Vukvoys Graven Spruce Forest, where they continue to live and roam."
"That doesn't change how I see them," said Bora. "They burned my village to the ground, killed my father, and kept me for labour." Luron sighed.
"I understand your hesitance towards Denoni, but take it against King Yosel, not his people. I've been to Rakent. That was, of course, before you were born. I have seen Denoni children behave no different from any human, dwarf, or elf child I've encountered."
"I know that," stammered Bora. "Denoni children ran and played like the ones in her village. They argued, played tricks on each other, and even played dragon-seek. Their mothers would linger by, smiling at their games. Sometimes they would nod at her, or another slave nearby. You're right in saying King Yosel's mandate is to blame, but his people acted on it. For now, I need some time before I can change how I see a common Denoni.
Did you hear that, Twig? Said Luron. There is still hope for you.
Excluding him, Bora corrected. Every dragon and monster are natives of Altendria, not the races of man, Denoni, elf, or dwarf. Chapter 5. The Lunar Wars. 3 days through Spiral Mountain, Bora wondered how her numb feet could reach another mile. Sometimes the wedges between her feet moved without warning. They were sharp, no better than the thorns of a drake's spine. Every night by the campfire, Luron made it a habit to leave him and take the safer roads and start a new life. Withholding her answer, she pressed the prince to her chest and closed her eyes. By midday, Rith grew finicky and began to cry. Bora rocked him and offered the blood of his last meal. Instead, the babe arched his back and wailed. Luron unsheathed his sword and insisted she keep him quiet. His sharp gaze shifted to every dark corner. "Is there a certain creature you're concerned of?" she asked while bouncing Rith over her shoulder.
"I'd rather you keep the twig quiet."
"I'm trying," she whispered, this time swaying the babe back and forth. "He's suddenly fidgety." A snap among the branches brought her to steer behind the seeker. "Did you hear that?"
"I did."
"Let's make a run for it."
"That may have worked for you in Graven Spruce Forest, but there are more than Vukfoys that lurk here, and this time lavender won't aid you."
He groaned when Rith grunted and released another cry.
"Blasted! Silence that boy!"
"Raising your voice will not help," she retorted. "It's quiet now. Perhaps it was nothing." Luron's piercing stare locked on her.
"And what if it's a Jersey devil?"
"A Jersey what?"
"They're horned beasts, like the Chelor, except with fiery red hair and the head of a horse."
Luron raised his hand over his head.
"They stand over 7 feet, with hooves for feet, and they bear the wings of a bat. The whip of their tail burns like a hot coal, and when they take flight, they will come for you, neighing like a stallion until you draw your last breath."
"Stop it," said Bora. "You said enough." She hushed the prince, but to no avail. His cries echoed through the denser parts of the forest. The sound that echoed back was a cackle.
"Keep your back against me, but keep walking."
Luron gave her his dagger.
"Alert me if you see anything."
The shrubs moved from a passing shadow. Bora raised her dagger against it, peering at the figure who stepped out. It stood under 4 feet, with grey skin and a long nose that outstretched their hairy bodies. "Speaker?" said a shaking Bora.
"I see them," he responded. "Mountain goblins."
Dozens scurried from the forest and revealed themselves. "Speaker, I can't fight."
"Just hold your weapon steady and think of every possibility."
Bora gripped the dagger even more. A crooked, confident smile exposed the goblin's yellow teeth. It was impossible to tell what they were looking at, as their entire eyes were black. One of them whispered to another and pointed its spear at Luron's cloak, at the red star edged on his fabric. With a single, almost respectable nod, they attacked. Bora waved her dagger against the one who thrust his spear at her. As he got closer, she pushed her back against Luron. The panic moved him forward. He took her dagger from her hands and flung it at the goblin, severing his head.
"Pick up its spear."
She retrieved the dropped spear and held it as steady as she could. Their sinister laughs brought Rith to cry. Another spear came towards them. This time, Luron crossed his blade at an angle and broke the spearhead from the shaft.
"Just keep your distance and don't let them near."
Another spear came again. He raised his elbow, rapidly drawing his sword upward, moving the spear over his body. His other hand reached for the shaft and yanked it from the goblin's hand. The goblins waved their axes. Those who came near would find the spear impaled in their heads. Not far, a goblin was among the trees, aiming his bow directly at Luron. "Speaker!" she cried, taking his arm and pulling him in time to miss the arrow. More goblins came and surrounded them, snickering and grinning at their victory. Luron's broad shoulders suddenly pressed against her.
"Stay close,"
he demanded. Bora pushed her back against him.
"Closer, and cover the twig."
She wrapped her cloak over him and wedged against the speaker. Rith muffled under the fabric. It surprised her that her fear allowed her to trust Luron without knowing what the next step was. Then she saw a spark of light gleaming from the goblin's ebony stare. A wave of fire burst out of the ground, barely grazing her, but scorching their attackers. This time she pressed hard against the speaker, that her poor shoes almost led her to slip. As the fire flashed before her face, the burning goblins scattered and rolled on the floor. After the wall of fire weakened, Luron grabbed her arm and led her through the burning bodies.
"Don't step on any blood they spilled," he warned,
taking her spear and throwing it against one of the burning bodies.
"If we carry a trace, they will find us."
After a mile down the mountain, the speaker's steps became sluggish. He wasn't harmed, but he panted more than she did. After licking his dry lips, he stopped to catch his breath. The soreness of her feet brought her to look at her shoes. "I didn't know you were as sensitive," said Bora. The slang was often used for humans who had the ability to cultivate and cast stellar magic. "My father said you could point them out by their unnatural hair colour, but yours is a plain dark brown."
"When you train under a speaker, you learn their craft. My master Essie was half dwarf and half human. Thanks to his dwarf side, his natural talent for the fire elemental was passed to me. He made me study Stellar, quite harshly if I remember correctly."
He wiped the sweat from his forehead and carried on.
"He would call me lazy, even though I spent countless hours awake, cultivating. But he was right, and I didn't care to practice it. To save us from the mountain goblins, I forced my elemental at the expense of my stamina."
When the birds sang again, Luron told them they were safe. Downhill, the spiralling rocks softened, giving Bora momentum to continue until sundown. The werewolves in Graven Spruce Forest were only the beginning. For hours, the goblins' laughter echoed in her mind. Altendria was a world of perilous corners. Who knew what danger awaited tomorrow? She didn't want to know nor guess if she would make it. Perhaps Luron was right. It was time to go. The fire flickered through the night, but Bora did not sleep. She stayed awake, observing the stars overhead until the speaker was sound asleep. Fearing dawn would break, she brushed her thumb over the babe's soft forehead. His eyes remained shut, and his mouth was partially open. She kissed his plump cheek, walked towards the speaker, and laid Rith beside him. She eyed his dagger, certain he would be fine if she took it. Pressing her hand gently on his belt, she claimed the blade. When she stepped away, it surprised her how tired he was not to discover his side weapon stolen. She expected more of the speakers her father spoke of. Before she left the welcoming fire, she looked at the babe one more time, snuggled beside the brown-haired man. Her heart wished the prince a long life, not the short one they meant him to have at birth. With the dagger in her hand, she joined the darkened trees at an anxious pace. The rising morning was cloudy, smearing the sky grey. At the end of Spiral Mountain was a crumbling wall, surrounded by a strip of land. Cracked stone had crumbled by natural elements. Meshed with the wall were spiked palisades, now rotting and chipped by travellers who needed fire. Fearing someone lurked among the ruins, she hurried down. Ahead, a vast open land stretched for miles, dry and cracked, keeping anything green and lush behind her. "This must be Aroga," Bora uttered. Before taking another step, she turned towards Spiral Mountain. The sun broke through the clouds and lit up the peak. She thought of the campfire she left, imagined Luron waking up and discovering Rith on his chest. Did it matter to the prince if she left? Would he even know the difference that someone else was carrying him? It didn't matter, because this was what she wanted. Maybe she didn't see it through, but Luron proved he meant to defend Rith against the goblins. In his care, at least she had got her freedom. Denonis were not to be trusted. That's what she repeated under her breath. With one last turn from the mountain, she wiped her sleeve against her moist cheeks. Luron guessed the prince didn't want to be held by him. If he adjusted his bag over his shoulder, the movement brought the babe to a whimper. No matter how much he squirmed, he didn't hum or rock him, not as Bora did. He stared at him until his eyes flickered open. Rith stared back, probably at the scruffy beard he grew. Luron's eyes didn't soften for him. He glared until the babe threw a fit of tears.
"You're crying at the wrong person," he said. "That thing you're looking for, be it motherly or fatherly affection, is not something I can offer."
Rith wailed without a break. With Bora gone, he could face another wave of goblins without a problem. The fewer bodies to protect, the better. Rith's face turned so red that Luron groaned at him.
"You best get used to having no guardianship, Twig. When I was 5, I fended for myself in the sandy dunes among other poor bastards. If I got hurt, there was no one to kiss my bruises."
The road that unravelled at the drop of the mountain paralysed him. His heart was just a muscle, and yet it pounded rapidly by the abandoned fortress before him, a stronghold from the last lunar war. Luron walked through the piles of rubble, kicking the bits out of his way. The once bricked walls were high, guarding the people of Altendria against the shrills of their foes. His breath quickened at what he discovered below. There, half buried, was a 1,000-pound bronze bell. The metal clapper was covered, but he couldn't forget the repetitive strike against the sound bow blaring in his mind. The cursed thing was in every stronghold of every kingdom, ringing at every sundown and every sunrise. A chirp of a passing bird called Luron back. In his arms the prince had grown quiet. Luron left the bell behind.
"Your father will one day build one of these," he said. "It's the only thing that pushes back every beast the cloaked knight summons to Eroga. For 29 days and 29 nights, every kingdom from the mainlands answers the call to defend their lands and halt the terrorizing monsters."
Against his will, he was back, bathed in blood, breathing the fragrance of iron. His legs drew forward against a man who bore the same cloak he once wore. He was below average in height, but had the posture of any tall man. Luron called out to him, warned him of the necromancer and the vial he flung to him. Luron blinked back to the present. Rith was still watching him.
"This stronghold,"
he hesitated to say.
"It must have belonged to Talonarch, or perhaps Desai."
Near the end of the mountain was more rubble of cracked stones. The longer Luron stared, the clearer he could hear his master, wailing as the black flame covered him from head to toe. He avenged his master by taking down the necromancer and claimed the last 2 vials he carried in his pocket. Luron gasped from the heavy memory. He spent 3 years in Spiral Mountain, and yet the anger and pain were still there. His steps halted at the brunette in her black cloak with gold stitching. She gave him no greeting, but her eyes softened. She showed him the blackberries she carried on her dress. Some were overripe, and its juices stained the grey fabric. "Hungry?" she said, grabbing one for her own. "They're sweet." Her gaze moved to the Denoni he held with one arm. "I'll carry him. You can carry the berries." Luron gladly made the trade. He noticed his fingers trembled when he picked a berry. Seeing the stronghold and coming back to Eroga caused it. "Are you all right?" she asked, noticing he was shaken.
"I am,"
he lied, and headed for the dead land. With a slight nod, she returned the dagger he let her steal. He inspected it for damages, anything to keep his mind distracted.
"Why have you come back?"
he said, placing it back in its holder. "Look at him," she said with shaking pursed lips. Rith nestled between her chest and started suckling his thumb.
"So what? He likes you. That isn't much explaining."
"I left Talonarch with him." Her eyebrows were compressed, showing her annoyance at his viewpoint. "I'm not leaving unless I know he will be all right." Half a day away was the peaking mountains of Griffinclaw. The last grain of light smoothed the west side to a soft peach. Luron knew they were close to reaching their destination when they made it to the Sword of Graves. Every blade was ingrained on the ground. It stood upright, with the tip ingrained on the ground. The pommel was rusted and broken from the years. Some were missing, leaving a mark that a sword was once there, but it was taken by anyone who needed it. It was disrespectful, but it wasn't like the dead needed it. "Why are there so many swords?" asked Bora, counting under her breath how many swords rotted around them.
"It's how we honour the dead,"
answered Luron. He was in no mood to tell the woman what it was, what it meant to him to attend the year he lost his master. The journey ended when they reached a round white platform surrounded by 6 pillars. Luron watched Bora climb the 5 steps and observe the abandoned area. As darkness covered the barren lands of Aroga, the pillars emitted a white glow. Bora marvelled at it, touching the pillar like it deserved her admiration.
"I wouldn't linger there too long," he warned.
"But it looks so majestic," she answered, showing the Denoni prince. "Look, Rith, isn't it pretty?"
"That is the Sintrar."
Luron dropped a pile of wood he brought with him from the forest and engulfed it with his flame. He preferred this light over the one behind him.
"That is where the 4 wizards imprisoned the Cloaked Knight."
"It seems like I have much to learn," said Bora. Luron couldn't believe she did not know what the name entailed. She sat across him and stared at the Sintrar with naive eyes. "When do the other speakers arrive?"
"I don't know," he said. "It could be another day."
Like the stars that sparkled their brilliance over their heads, the fire flickered through the night. Since Spiral Mountain became a fading dot, a new chill accompanied them. Luron observed it in Bora, who never looked behind, not trusting that he saw nothing. "I've never met elves or dwarves." She settled the prince on her chest. "But my father said you could tell them apart by their ears."
"Your knowledge of the world hangs by your ears and what your dear daddy said, doesn't it?"
Bora pressed her lips tightly. "I was born and raised in my village. We had no mountain goblins to fear, no Jersey devil to have nightmares of. And need I remind you that I was enslaved?"
"All right," sighed Luron. "What did your father say this time?"
He wasn't exactly interested, but talking got her to stop looking over her shoulder every time a wolf howled. "Isla elves have wide oval-shaped ears with a gentle curve at the tip." Bora used her finger against the ground to trace what she imagined it would look like. "Tredal elves have brown to dark skin tones, but the best giveaway is their long and narrow pointy ears."
"And what of Ardi elves?" he asked.
"Ardi?"
"They're the mixed breed of both Isla and Tredal elves."
He drew an ear, no rounder or sharper.
"Their ears have no sharper tip than the 2.
"And dwarves?" she asked.
"Few men barely reach above 5 feet, and women didn't go past 4.5.
His thoughts shifted to his late master.
"They have a talent for infusing stellar in their weapons."
"You mentioned your master was a half-human and half-dwarf?"
"Aye."
Luron opened his bag and took out his sallet helmet. Polished and well cared for, it reflected the stars. The back had a length that protected his neck. Now it was too big for him to wear.
"For a dwarf who did not come from the lineage of mastersmiths, Essie was a talented swordsmith. He had an ability he called mending. He used it to make this sallet helmet. Because of it, the only part of my body that doesn't bear a scar is my face."
Luron covered the helmet and placed it back in the bag.
"After my master's passing, I keep this as a memento of his craftsmanship."
A stiff wind blurred through, bringing in dust and the same chill that Aroga carried. "These lands are strange," said Bora, rubbing her arms. "Nothing lives among them but rocks and stone."
I read somewhere in a book that it was once vibrant, but it lost its beauty when the First Lunar War began.
Bora's eyes widened. It was ridiculous for him that she appeared to recognize the name, but not Iroga or Sintrar.
Your father didn't care to mention the place nor the monster that created this havoc, but he mentioned what we call it.
"You would have to be adult to not know the Lunar War," Bora defended. "The blind would have heard its name, and the mute would have felt the mainland shake from it." She looked around even more and pressed Rith closer. "I wasn't born when the last one occurred, but the aftermath created my village." Her fearful eyes shifted to the speaker. "No wonder you looked dazed at those old fortress walls."
"We call them strongholds."
Luron looked at her and the flame.
"The last one was a blur, but my first is as clear as a river's water."
Bora's feet aligned with themselves, her attention locked to him. For a moment she looked like a child, being told a grand story before bed, but it was his nightmare.
"I was 16, had recently passed the trials at Darkmurk Forest, and gained the official recognition as a Seeker, the successor of my master, but then the Lunar War began. The Great Witch Alinda predicted the month it would come. Even so, I was not prepared."
He looked at his sword.
"My master was a man of lessons. He said my chances of surviving were lesser than a vampire and werewolf embracing one another. But Essie protected me, even after a swarm of abundant ones surrounded us."
"Abundant ones," repeated Bora. "Those are the corpse-eaters that will reveal the next Lunar War. My father would say the name, so I wouldn't stay up with Rithian."
"Rithian?"
repeated Luron, looking at the sleeping babe. "The man I named this little prince after." There was a frown when she said it, that she looked away. "How did you survive such a massacre?" Luron pressed his left hand over his chest. Underneath the garments, he bore more scars than a man should in his lifetime.
"When you fight for 30 nights, you become so numb you feel like you're already dead."
He moved his hand away and sighed.
"It's bad luck to talk about such awful times on these lands."
He laid on his back and folded his arms under his head.
"Let's get some rest."
The night carried, with Luron staring at the stars. He had to make the Sintra their meeting point. No matter how much the sight invited his memory of the dead, he sought comfort in knowing there was no prediction for the next one. Being back after so long, his heart burned hate for the Cloaked Knight, who, by the grace of the four wizards, only the moon could imprison him so that life in the mainlands could be normal. But it was only just an illusion. The Lunar War hung on him heavily, and he had seen that same heaviness among the veterans and in the pupils of the kings and queens who survived it. Before sleep took him, he thought of his master, who taught him to think of every possibility. Luron touched the last remaining vial he kept in his pocket. If it wasn't for the necromancer who swung one and cast his black flame, Essie would still be alive. It is a rare sight to find a unicorn, that many find the creature a myth. Chapter 6. A Chance. The chill in the air stirred Bora awake. Wrapped in layers and cozied up to her chest was the sleeping prince. His skin was like his father, fairer than the pale flowers she picked for the palace. As she roused herself up, her back ached from having slept on the barren ground. Across was Luron, sound asleep with his chin tucked towards his chest and his arms in a defensive cross. Since she met him, he had never shown a relaxed posture. Even in his sleep, he appeared distrustful of the rest he was getting. The whispers brought her to turn to the Sintrar. She squinted from the sun's rays and tried to make out the cloaked figures standing on the platform. "Speaker," she muttered. "Speaker, wake up." Their whispering stopped when Luron groaned himself awake. He blinked a few times before looking at what Bora pointed at. Clearing his throat, he grabbed his cloak and swung it over his one shoulder and secured it around his neck. While he calmly put his baldric on and adjusted it to his chest, it relaxed her. They were not in danger. "Come on." His voice was still low from being recently awake. Bora gently leaned Rith on her chest and started tying her cloak. Luron joined the 4 cloaked figures on the platform. A 5th was at the steps, hunched and covered from head to toe. Before she took a step toward the Sintra, she noticed 3 7-year-olds on top of a pile of boulders, huddling among each other for warmth. They had to be Seekers. They were too young to be present on matters as important as this.
"Luron, I hope your letter was a joke."
A man broke the silence and moved his hood back. His wavy chestnut hair wrapped around his cheeks. Bora would have mistaken him for a girl if it wasn't for his thick eyebrows and Adam's apple. The shape of his ear was almost exactly what she drew on the dirt. He was an Isla elf.
"We wouldn't be on the worst place in all Tendria for a joke."
The rough voice came from a dwarven man. His beard was parted and braided into 2. On his hand was a pipe he prepared for smoking. Another cloaked speaker pulled back her hood. Bora thought she was a human until she caught the slant on the tip of her ears, nestled between her curly black hair. Unable to blink, her breath quickened. It was as if the Sintra's pillars bulged to confine and squeeze her. She didn't just know the curve was Denoni ears, she was a familiar face. Glancing at her cloak, the blue symbol stitched on the fabric looked like a snowflake with 9 arrowheads pointing outward. "This is a trap!" Bora drew so far back she stepped on the hot log that burned from last night's campfire. She winced from the pain, as her shoes did not offer the protection she needed. Glancing back at the dark-skinned woman, her panic doubled. "Speaker, that woman is from Talonarch!"
"Calm down," said Luron, who glanced at the Denoni woman and back at Bora. "Now as the Speaker of the North."
"And a citizen of Talonarch." Now curled a smile, "as you rightfully said." Luron stepped off the platform and grasped Bora's arm, stopping her from shifting further back. Her lips quivered after Now smiled, exposing her teeth, showing canines instead of fangs. Why did that woman conceal her cloak when she saw her in the palace? Luron's squeeze on her arms brought her to look at him.
"Now we'll not kill the twig," he promised.
Bora's thoughts spun out of control. The sharp light of the morning brought a pound to her head. Noticing Luron's hold persisted, she wrestled her arms free. Now's chuckle made the dwarf shake his head.
"Though you are the leader, you just can't help but remain unprofessional."
"Oh, fine," answered Now, placing her hands on her hips. "Bora, right? Let me teach you something about speakers that Luron failed to mention." She twinkled another smile and brushed her braided curls to the side, showing an unobstructed view of her Denoni ears. "My allegiance is to Altendria before my country and kind." Her swift feet led her to stand behind her. Bora slammed her forehead against Luron's chest, fearing the woman would tie her and return her to the palace, to King Yosel, to Queen Sarita. Rith shuffled from the altercation and began to cry. "You shouldn't have brought her here, Luron." Now circled them. "They are searching ever so thoroughly for her and the Secondborn." The squeeze of Luron's fingers moved Bora from his chest.
"Give me the child," he said with an annoyed tone. "You're acting hysterical."
Though her legs hadn't stopped shaking, her hold of Rith remained strong and secure. Her absent-mindedness, flooded by fear and confusion, brought Luron to almost touch noses with her.
"No harm will come to him. I trust everyone in this group with my life."
"You better listen to him," said the Isla elf.
"Luron is honest in his words, so much that he doesn't play with them."
Bora's hold loosened. From the offence on Luron's face, she guessed he would take the prince by force. She unwrapped Rith from her carrier, swaddled by the embroidery cloth Luron used to keep his bread fresh. Her sore arms relaxed when she handed Rith over. Luron didn't keep him for long. Instead, he gave the prince to Now. "What are you doing?" Bora rushed to get the infant back. Luron laid out his arm and blocked her. "I gave him to you, not so you can give him to her."
"You're stupid if you think you can do anything about it," he added. "Now we'll kill you if you try."
Bora clamped her mouth. Her anger burned for being betrayed by the speaker's promise. Now observed the child and sniffed his face. Her green eyes flickered red before going back to normal. She undid her leather armor, ripped her tunic, and pulled out her left breast. Her nipple, the colour of black cherries, went towards Rith's lips. Within moments, he latched and suckled. "This is troubling news indeed." Now walked back to the platform, "but I'll make this meeting short. We must return him. If my king suspects the cardinal points have him, the blame may fall on the Order or the Follow."
"I shared the same thoughts when I left my cabin," said Luron. "Keeping him will invite unwanted tension with the other races. Stev?"
The Isla elf who sat at the steps waved his hand to show he didn't care about the decision. "I knew the infant's fate was doomed when Mary gave me your message. Brolin, you're the oldest of us all. What say you?" The dwarf cleared his throat, but he said nothing. He smoked his pipe and withdrew a cloud of tobacco. "Talanark is not known for being merciful," Stev continued. "Killing him now would be a blessing." The words from his mouth hit Bora. Her father mentioned nothing of this vulgar talk when he praised the speakers. Did he mean it, or was he masking the truth with a lie?
"Easy there," said Brolin. "This boy's fate is already a tragedy."
"Keeping him carries too many risks," said Now. "This is a waste of time." Stev gave Luron a disappointed look. "You risked your mission at Spiral Mountain for this?"
"I couldn't just leave him there,"
defended Luron. Bora felt her head spin from their words. Everyone agreed Rith had to be sent back. She walked up the platform with her shoulders as still as the Sintrar's pillars. Without blinking, she charged towards Now, ready to swipe the babe from her arms. To her surprise, Luron wrapped his arm around her neck and locked it in place. In a panic, Bora sank her teeth into his arm. He released, freeing her, but not before she took his dagger. Bora raised the blade to Now, who calmly raised her hand. Bora didn't understand why she did it until one of the children that sat on the boulder had jumped off. Her blonde hair swayed by the current of the wind. Her hand was on the grip of her sword. "I can handle this, Melanie," said Now. Her eyes were as still as water, unwilling to break from Bora. "The boy is not your kin, and yet you raised that dagger against me." The corner of her lips curled, almost like she took pleasure in her act. "King Yosel marked you and the boy as our enemy. If you want to live, turn around and get out of here." Bora looked to Luron, in hopes he would defend her, but he gave her a stony stare while he massaged the bite mark. She wanted to live and contemplated her freedom, but every time she glanced at Rith, she couldn't abandon him. Reasoning arrived too late, staring at her quivering hands, barely holding the dagger. There was no way she could win against a speaker. The dagger dropped. Instead of claiming his weapon back, Luron stared at Rith, happily in Now's arms, suckling his prized milk. His view moved towards the way back to Spiral Mountain. Bora looked in the same direction.
"The boy made such a fuss throughout the entire trip, until we passed through his father's strongholds. Maybe that is a sign."
"Don't think about it." Speaker Stev marched towards him in a huff. His ears turned red when he turned towards Now's exposed breasts. "Talanark's civil war was before our time, but that doesn't change that they want the boy back. And if he grows up, he will be hunted."
"If Rith becomes my seeker, perhaps King Yosel will stop his pursuit," Luron answered.
"His reach into becoming a seeker is many years away, and that's on the chance that the boy reaches 16.
"Then I will hide my location until the boy is ready."
The four cloaks glanced at one another. Their silence spoke volumes. Neither had any motivation to agree. Finally, the dwarf groaned.
Harbouring the second prince from Talonarch will put us in the line of fire.
He puffed his pipe and withdrew the smoke.
Especially you now, and your apprentice is too young to face the country's mistrust.
Hassler said Rith's brother would be raised to be as cruel as his father. Bora looked at every one of them, except for Stav, who had his eyes on Now. If he lives, good can come of it. You naive child. Now dropped her head to look at Rith. You have no idea of the horrible monstrosities that occurred when the last pair of royal twins were born. Her green gaze darkened to red. Hassler should know better. Bora gripped her cloak. I know you see me as a simple commoner, a woman with no title or strength to display any merits to win your trust, but Rith doesn't deserve this. Tell me why he can't be spared, so I may understand. Many years ago, 2 princesses were born to Talonarch. Now traced her fingers over Rith's delicate forehead. They deemed the firstborn the future queen, as old traditions go. The secondborn princess lived as a warrior and won the respect of her people. But in the palace, she was treated like a second-rate citizen. They even doubted she had Nari's blessing. When the king of Talonarch died, the firstborn went to claim the throne, only to find her sister holding Midnight, the sword Nari gave to the royal family. Conflict broke from within and spread through every city, town, and village like an infestation. It gave rise to our second civil war, but this time the second-born princess did something nobody expected. She welcomed the 8 tribe back to the north. Their invasion brought death to every doorstep. It wasn't until the firstborn did something the secondborn could not do. Midnight responded to her in battle, deeming her the true ruler. Many of the secondborn's loyal men and women turned on her. The 8 tribe, as you know, still control half of the north. I'm confident that Queen Sarita and King Yosel do not want a repeat. Peace was restored, but those who remained loyal to the second-born princess fled and founded Lentry. It is not his fault he was born to such a world, said Bora. Give him a chance. Let him convince you that he is worth shielding.
That woman will never understand, said Stev, who glanced at Luron. But you are in need of an apprentice. Taking this little leech could be his only chance at survival.
Hey, I have ears. Now eyed Stev.
I know, that's why I said it. He winked.
We can't return the boy to Talonarch, said Brolin.
Hope stirred Bora by the dwarf, who tapped his pipe to clear it out.
The follow would not let anyone bearing Nari's blessing to fall under their deliberate desire to execute him.
His input received no retort, so he continued. We must come to an agreement. He pointed at Luron. And you? For too long you have shunned the responsibility of taking an apprentice. If you take him, then the follow must be made aware of it.
I hoped someone would take an extra student if I died, Luron admitted.
He gazed at Rith and back at the speakers.
I will claim responsibility over the boy, but I will need your support and more falcons in case this goes downhill. Raise your hands if you agree.
Now and Stav raised their hands at the same time. Following him was the dwarf. They turned to the quiet one, who sat in silence, covered entirely by his red cloak. When he rose, his stature was taller than any of the men, than any man she had ever seen. When the hood was drawn back, Bora lost her breath. Horns protruded from his skull, and his eyes did not differ from that of goats. His ears folded downwards, white fur coated his neck. Bora immediately picked up the dagger she dropped and raised it against him. Look at you, said Now. Upon seeing a cello, you act just like a citizen of Talonarch. Her index finger lowered the dagger. Ethan is not from the 8 tribe. He's from the mountains of Wessofer. Is he a speaker? She gulped.
Nay, he answered. I am the messenger, tasked with storing and sending private communications to the speakers. I train their falcons.
He raised his hand.
And I don't care for politics.
Luron raised his hand as the final vote. and then he snatched his dagger from Bora.
"That's enough of your prejudices," he said. "Ethan has never acted in violence or raised his voice. He doesn't deserve your blade."
Bora apologised. She was grateful the Chalor agreed to support Rith. "What do we do now?" "Before Melanie and I left, they sent 2 scouts to the town of Vistra," said Now. "Luron, I suggest you find solace near the ocean waters. The mainlands cannot protect you, and as the leader, I can only do so much." "So protective," Stev said in a teasing voice. "I would do the same for you," said Now, "but don't underestimate my people. King Yosol is patient. He will not make a fuss. But Queen Sarita, who knows what she will do to reclaim this boy?" The babe cried at the mention of his mother. Now smiled and rocked him. "Well, aren't you a smart one? Who told you she's a manipulative wench? That's right. Who told you?"
"Now,"
chided Luron. "Right." Now cleared her voice. "If I cover your tracks now, we can give you a month's head start to ensure you are not followed."
"Perhaps I can speak to the Duke of Isildervan," said Brolin. "It's furthest from Talanark. With some persuasion, he may offer a spot among the Cyan Mountains."
"We can make further arrangements by Falcon," said Ethan.
"Great, then you best be going."
Brolin shuddered when he glanced at the pillars.
"Don't forget you have a target on your back."
"Aye," said Luron. "Safe travels to you all."
"And safe travels to you," they responded.
The speakers called on their apprentices and announced their departure. Now handed the full-bellied Rith back to Bora, who took him with care. "What of the woman?" Her lips curved when she said it. "Will she be your mistress?" It came as a shock that Bora looked at Luron. He stared back, not hiding his bitterness towards her.
"I will ask the Duke to take her in," he said, shaking his head. "After the bite mark, I want her more than an arm's length away."
Now snickered. "Come on, Melanie." The girl who tried to fight Bora ran up the platform. She was as pale as the white pillars, her eyes were soft blue, and 2 red ribbons tied her golden hair. After the group left, Luron walked down the platform and headed for their campfire.
"The safest and quickest route would be west, past the Griffinclaw Mountains and towards the West Lux portals."
He hunched over his bag, tied the opening with lace, and flung it over his shoulder.
"The problem at hand is that those are well-known roads, with travellers from all the mainlands. Our only option is to take the long roads."
The more he talked, the more it reminded Bora of how quickly he gave Rith to Now. She approached him with shaking hands, wishing he would shut up.
"At this rate, and with no horse, it will take us more than a year, so don't complain," he demanded, "or I will leave you the next time you decide to sneak away, and this time I won't let you take my dagger."
Bora tapped his shoulder, and he turned. Without warning, she delivered a hard slap across his scarless cheek. "I trusted you!" In her anger, tears flowed from her eyes. "But you gave Rith to that vampire!" Luron rubbed his cheek with a frown.
"You are an impossible woman, you know that."
He marched west in a huff and called out,
"The sooner I get rid of you, the better. You were the first-rate reminder as to why I didn't want an apprentice or company."
Bora didn't mind how far he went. Rith still had to be secured in her wrap. He was too far to hold the babe, so she dropped her cloak on the ground and laid the prince on it. After retying the knots, she looked back at the speaker. He stopped. His jaw was open, rubbing his cheek.
"A horse," he exclaimed in anger. "That's the first thing I will look for."
She hated his tone, and more so when he told her to hurry up. With Rith finally nestled in her wrap, she grabbed the cloak and marched towards him. In a fit of anger, she swung her cloak over her, surprised that the speaker averted his gaze. He stared at her hips before the cloak covered them. Pale flowers only grow in the north side of the mainlands, specifically in Talanark's high mountains.
Chapter 7. Invasive Thoughts. King Yosul rose from his bed and leaned at the end. The flickering candlelight danced against the darkened room. Since it was lit at twilight, it cast the shadow of the bronze centerpiece of a woman kneeling in long robes, holding a blade with teeth that flared out of the tip. The window invited the crescent moon and the streams of clouds passing by. With only his tunic on, he ambled towards the table. His foot brushed the belt he left on the floor, leaving the buckle to scrape against the stone floor. A soft moan stirred from his bed. The noblewoman who accompanied him for the night shuffled her bare hips to the side. She slept sound asleep while he hadn't had a minute. His insomnia led him to the gloomy halls of his palace, where he passed many floors. He paced and paced for hours until he found himself entering the nursing room of his firstborn. A sheer drape hung from the ceiling and wrapped around his gilded cradle. The alerted wet nurse swiftly left her seat and delivered a bow. King Yosul dismissed her. He stood at the end of the cradle and observed the heir to his kingdom. His long gown was red and adorned with gold silk. He slept on his back, with his arms apart and his fists clenched.
"I delayed giving you a name for too long," he told his son. "My mind still remains restless. Enemies continue to test our borders, and your mother's attempt to correct her mistake has been unfruitful."
After a month had passed, no news of the palace worker who fled with the second-born arose. King Yosul held his wife in contempt, specifically the ones who served his queen during her labour. Whenever he saw them walking his halls, the slave woman and the second-born would invade his mind. After a week, he couldn't take it, and sent the royal physician, midwives, and high court maidens to death. The penalty was for leaving the second-born alone, for trusting their queen that they would keep her secret and harbour a slave in her chamber. The lords of the border have started to become useless to him. When they first discovered the voyage charm the slave used belonged to Hassela, they searched all of Talonarch, but she left no trace. King Yosul growled. The discreet woman had to have gone beyond their borders. But to where? And who gave the daft idea to betray him? The sound from his throat brought his son to whimper from his sleep. In an attempt to focus on the present, he watched his son's tiny chest rise and fall.
"Your name," he said. "Your name will be Inari, after Nari, the dragon that blessed the first queen of Talonarch."
Satisfied by his decision, he looked towards the window, where the clouds met the warm-coloured sky. On Earth, Denoni lived as nonconformists, roaming and hunting the lands, never settling for contentment over property and community until the Age of Asylum, until the first queen was gifted the North. Together they remained strong, and together they will reclaim what the 8 tribe had taken. A soft knock brought him to look away. The wet nurse he dismissed returned with a bow and said he had a visitor. With the permission of his nod, she opened the door, allowing Lord Demlo to arrive with a brief bow. "Your Majesty, we found bits of Hassela's voyage charm at Spine Ridge."
"Have my horse prepared," he said. "I will personally investigate the whereabouts of that woman."
Every kingdom in the mainlands is bounded to obey dragon law. Those who refuse to comply are investigated by the Follow, also known as the Dragon People. Chapter 8. Cider and Pear Inn. 6 months later. When Bora first saw the Lux portal, she couldn't believe the large arch made of stone could transport people from one point of the mainlands to another. Luron told her that sovereign rulers weren't allowed to claim them. As a result, wealthy merchants used them for fast travel, and villages sprouted around them. Some were unmanaged towns, where only desperate, weary travellers would stop for supplies.
Luron described them as self-governed shanty towns, dangerous but perfect to hide for the time being. When they arrived at Yvette, the town left her with a sour impression. Glorious to the eyes was an overstated compliment. She saw better communities in Talonark, where roads were swept clean, and not a dung from a horse was left for careless pedestrians. The sun was setting, and the candles from the windows lighted the narrow streets. One of the cramped cottages opened. A large, snorting pig walked out. Behind the animal was a man with a moist forehead. Bora inched towards the speaker's arm.
"Just keep looking straight," he answered in an irritated tone.
She knew he wanted to reach the Ardy elf town, Graven, but she and Rith could not endure another day. 6 months had passed since they left Aroga, and the speaker wanted to expedite their travel. A month ago, Luron purchased a horse at a high price. He discovered they cheated him because the horse was skittish and stubborn along the road. When a band of thieves fenced them, he gave it away and counted his losses. Much of the food they ate was thanks to his hunting. It was the only way he could fill his and the Denoni prince's bellies. Whenever Bora's monthly came, he carried the little prince while she washed her rags and groaned from her backaches. Any time he held Rith, he grumbled at the wet marks he left on his shirt, accusing him of purposely peeing on him. Bora avoided the eyes of the passing folks. Many inns resided in dead-end alleys that Luron avoided until he concluded that the locals did it on purpose. Yvette prospered because travellers or criminals needed a place to stay. The deeper into town they were, the longer they would stay. Passing another alleyway, Rith began to whimper. It wasn't his usual cries that demanded food and comfort. This one ended with a gurgling sound.
"He always makes that strange noise at the oddest hour,"
Luron commented. He glanced at Bora, seeing she covered her nose.
"And you always do that when he makes it."
"There's more to a Denoni's heightened sense of smell," she said. "They can unearth memories of blood that once soiled the ground."
"I know that," he answered, unimpressed by her knowledge. "Now used it whenever we were assigned to search for a killer."
He soured at the ruffled-looking men who won their attention by Rith's cry.
"Come, we can't be picky of where we stay any longer."
He led them to the nearest establishment, called Cider and Pear Inn. The name sounded inviting, but the tattered rug beneath Bora's feet was unwelcoming. The innkeeper didn't greet them. Her eyes were glued to her dirty nails as Luron requested a room. He never asked for two, not while they were under his protection. Whenever it came to talking to another, Bora would grow quiet. It wasn't that she was shy, but that her long years of being silent in the presence of others were difficult to scrub off. The room they were given was small. A smell in the sheets lingered that Luron chose not to investigate.
"We will rest only for the night,"
he said, leaving his bag of coins on the desk with no chair.
"I don't like this town, and I saw many crooks."
"We stayed for 3 days at the last inn." Bora just finished changing Rith's cloth diaper and swaddled him with a wool blanket they purchased on the road. She didn't want to get rid of the embroidery breadcloth, but Luron no longer wanted to look at it.
"That town had decent folk,"
he said, not minding that Bora gave him the babe so that she could give her back a break.
"Eiseldurven is still far, and we must arrive on time."
"But why the hurry? Is now not covering our tracks?"
"You seem to forget that Brolin prearranged a meeting with Lord Durvan about taking you in as a kitchen worker."
Bora stopped rubbing her back and reclaimed Rith from the speaker's hands. The babe had grown his first tooth and was at the age where he found everything fascinating. She sat him on the bed Luron wouldn't touch and let him support himself. His back was strong, and when he smiled, her eyes started to water.
"I know you don't want to part with him, but he cannot stay with you."
Bora was used to Luron's frowns. The travel didn't draw them close, except that he only smiled when she complimented his stews. "I know what we agreed." She still could not part her sight of the little prince. "I just want to enjoy every moment with him." The next morning, Bora stretched herself out of bed. Though her feet were sore,
she appreciated a night's rest. On the floor was Luron, sound asleep with the same serious look. The hard wooden floors he had slept at every inn they shared made her worry about the state of his back, like she did for her father. She offered to join in her bed, with Rith as their divider, but Luron always denied her request. "You must find me repulsing," she whispered. She wished she could meet the woman who made the breadcloth, just so she could see what kind of woman it took to make him less tense and guarded. Bright-eyed from her rest, she tapped her fingers against the mattress and stared at his coined purse on the table. Since they were leaving soon, some juicy apples would keep them healthy for the journey. Perhaps Luron could hunt a deer along the way, so he could make the stew she enjoyed. For that, she would need potatoes and carrots. Taking the coins of lesser value, she glanced at him and at Rith and left the room. On the first floor of the Cider and Pear Inn, an old map on the wall marked their location. It was just the northwest, showing the names of the villages she had visited and the ones that weren't on the map. North from Yvette was a kingdom named Desai. Further south, two more, Mency and Sestoria. The thought brought Bora back to her father. War made him into a man of few words. When he answered Kentin's call for the Lunar War, rogue bandits who sought their opportunity with fewer men to protect their property raided his village. When he returned, his family became one of the casualties. Bora's heart raced at the painful realization. She left the inn and drew in the air outside. Her beloved father was young when he deserted Kentin. When he started his new life, he must not have wanted another wife or children, but when he did, he lost his family twice. The mist from the mountains fell and shrouded the town. As Bora asked for directions for the marketplace, she met friendly faces. Luron was overcautious when he said they wouldn't stay long. Sure, the streets reeked of feces, and there were more beggars, but she liked the diverse faces. She met more at a square where humans ran the shops, and dwarves sold their trinkets along a row of vendors. Some sold spices she had never seen, coloured purple and green. Seeing no vegetable stand, she asked a dwarf who sold leather pouches for directions. Two men who were looking at his wares turned to her. Before the dwarf could answer, one of them pointed down at what he called the market alley. It couldn't have been more opportune. Market alleys were not great in quality, but they would leave her with coins to return to Luron. The further down the alleyway, Bora's confident steps slowed down. The moisture and smell of the horses that passed by made her pull her cloak to her face. There were no vendors present, just a cold and dark passage. When a puddle echoed behind her, she could not turn around in time. A pair of rough hands grabbed her and pinned her against the wall. The other, who looked like a bag of bones, pulled her cloak off. Unwilling to be another helpless maiden, Bora sent a kick to his groin. In return, sharp knuckles crossed her cheek. She whimpered while the thin man unbuckled himself. The one who pinned her was muscular enough to grip her jaw open. When his tongue ran down her neck, he left an awful smell. The memory she tried to forget paralysed her. It sent her back to that morning in the palace, where she walked down every hall to replace the pale flowers of every vase. A passing knight stormed behind her, covered her lips, and placed a coin in her pocket. He attempted to rape her, and he would have achieved it if it wasn't for the hands that gently grabbed his face. Before he could react, his neck was twisted. Bora remembered how much she trembled at the discovery of her saviour, the King of Talonarch. King Yosel didn't acknowledge her with his eyes, but told her to get back to work. Confused but indebted, she mustered her words of gratitude, but before she could utter them, his voice broke through her and directed them to a woman who followed him.
"Remind everyone that my kingdom was not a red light district," he told her.
The woman bowed. She had no cloak, but the curls were familiar. Was that woman now? A cooing brought Bora back. Tears streamed down her eyes. The men had thrown her cloak on the ground, and before her was not the King of Talonarch, but his son. Rith's sandy-coloured eyes recognised her. He smiled, unaware that she was in trouble.
"Leave her,"
Luron looked harmless with his sword in one hand and Rith in the other like a shield. His eyes, on the other hand, chilled her bones. The men turned and grumbled at their interruption.
"And why should we?"
the stalky one said.
"This alley serves only one purpose, and she entered willingly."
"That woman is mine." Bora trembled when they unsheathed their short swords.
"All right, speaker, you clearly didn't hear us well."
The muscular one nodded at his friend.
"Pity that you came to rot in a whore's alley.
And by the shape of your gladius and your stance without a shield, you must be soldiers from Kentin."
Luron's piercing stare didn't waver.
"Or perhaps you stole the blade from their loyal knights."
"You'll never know, since you will be dead."
The thin man swung his sword at a speed that forced Bora to shriek. Luron lifted his shoulder to the side to keep Rith from the blade and met the short sword with his blade. The kick Bora left the man in kept him unsteady. When he tried to swing at him, Luron readily tripped him with his legs. One foot hankered against his back, and the sharp tip of his sword kept him still.
"Don't move, lest you know what's good for you," he warned.
Bora pulled against the arms of the stalky man, but she couldn't stop him from pulling her hair back and steadying his blade against her throat. The chill she saw in Luron's gaze darkened now. They stayed that way, even after he shoved his sword through the man's spine. Distracted by the wails of his partner, Luron acted and turned his sword against the man. He reacted by throwing Bora to the ground and drawing his blade to protect his life. The tip crossed Luron's cheek while his sword lopped off his head. As the blood spilled and marked the alley red, Rith squirmed and opened his mouth.
"They're not worth drinking,"
he said, unaware that the blood from his cheek dripped onto the babe's cheek. Bora grabbed her cloak and followed Luron out of the alley, in silence. The vendors were an earshot away. Just as the onlookers did nothing when she almost got violated, they didn't bother to defend the men who tried. Before they went to their rooms, Luron silently paid for another night. The blood on his cheek didn't bother the innkeeper. She shrugged and looked at his pay. Back in the room, the same silence persisted. He would not look at her, and she was still shaken. Seeing the drip of blood on the ground, she acted. "Let me see your wound." Bora sat Rith on the bed and reached for the only clean towel the inn provided.
"No, thank you."
Luron swiped the towel from her hands and pressed it to his cheek. His eyes widened at the red-faced Rith.
"By the Creator."
The babe smiled and clapped his red hands. His blood painted him like a tomato. Seeing the speaker's anger, Bora apologized and cleaned the Danoni. Before the night had ended, neither of them talked. If she tried, she confronted his piercing stare. At dawn, Luron was awake. He sat on the ground and packed his bags. A cheap thin cloth poorly bandaged his cheek, and he didn't want treatment in a town full of lawbreakers. Bora gently roused out of bed, hoping not to wake Rith. The attempted assault didn't change her normal behaviour. While he spent the late hours awake, she was the first to fall asleep. There were many times he wanted to ask her if she was all right, but perhaps she was a stronger woman than he thought. In mid-yawn, she caught him staring at her. "What is it?"
"Nothing."
"You're finally talking to me?"
"I should have taught you how to use a sword."
He restrained himself from talking to her because her innocent stare brought back the men in the alleyway. If the cleaning maid hadn't roused him that morning, Bora would have been gone.
"You will not have my protection in Isle Dervan. How will you get out of trouble next time?"
"I can say I'm your woman." Luron stopped packing, unwilling to meet her gaze.
"I said that in hopes they would reconsider."
He probably should have killed the men while they were busy with her. Then he wouldn't need to tend the cut he was left in. He gripped his bag. The thought of the men touching her angered him again. Bora took a clean cloth she purchased for her monthly days. He didn't want to use it, but now, seeing the poor bandage soaking, he saw her pity. Just as she was about to reach for his cheek, he slapped her hand away, leaving her out of words. "Why won't you let me near you?" She picked up the cloth from the floor and brushed any dust that gathered. "Have we not been travelling together all these months?"
If I want a woman near me, I need only to walk a few blocks and pay a few coins,
Luron said, hoping she would get the hint that he wanted no tending. The cut on his cheek throbbed by how tightly he clenched his jaw. Was it that bad? To take a look, he brought the helmet he cherished to his face. It was thicker than he imagined. Seeing Bora's worried look again made his nostrils flare.
You know, I was proud that my face was scar-free. Now I'm going to have to grow one because of you.
Bora's stare persisted. At least it was just your skin and not your head. Her look turned to pity again. He wanted to make her feel guilty, and he achieved it, but it didn't steer her away. She raised her cloth towards his face once more. Before she touched him, he grabbed her wrist and held it from his face.
I cannot guarantee what will happen the next time you touch me.
He would snarl if he could, not against her, but at the hopelessness he felt inside. He didn't want to arrive at Dervan with an emotional attachment. Anything but that. Luron, Bora's lips gently curved. Are you trying to scare me?
You were adult to go out there on your own.
He released her wrist.
Keep your personal space to yourself and don't wander off without letting me know.
Putting his helmet back in his bag, he thought that was the end of it. He paused when her figure leaned towards him. She pressed her chest against his, bringing his eyes widened at her boldness. I don't want to keep my personal space to myself. Her gaze softened for him. Not from you. Her weight moved him back and sent him to the floor. Her chestnut hair laced over his face, and the cloth she kept in hand finally replaced his poor one. As she held it against his skin, her sweet lips softened onto his. The hips he found the most attractive were now his. It's not that dragons are a rare sight, but that they have entrusted the mainlands to the nations that rule them. Chapter 9. Dervan. 5 months later. When the port city of Isel was under a new ruler, his or her first name was added with the city. The dwarven establishment was on the southwest corner of the mainlands, ruled by the Grand Duke, Lord Dervan. Its citizens were known for their thick garments, colourful with blends of brown, gold, and red patterned designs. The wavy lining at the collar and sleeves was funny and appealing to the eyes. Luron watched Bora pace around the market square, telling him that her village had no resources or talent to make accessories like the ones the dwarves made. Bora had stopped again to survey the wares of yet another vendor. She looked no better than a child at a festival.
I don't understand, he told the 1-year-old Rith. She's hard-headed, impatient, and outspoken. Nothing like the women I'm used to.
Smiling, Bora turned to look at him, not knowing he was talking about her. He hadn't gotten used to the countless times her face made his heart beat faster. Gems and stones glimmered so brightly she squinted. Damn it all, she was beautiful. What were you and the laddie talking about? Brolin's unexpected arrival startled him. They were supposed to meet at Treasure Inn, but Bora's excitement with Dervan had slowed them down. The Speaker of the South left Morothan to introduce him to Lord Dervan properly. Though speakers were reliable, foreign leaders preferred the audience of their race.
Nothing that concerns you.
Luron followed the wondering Bora to avoid explaining his conversation with Rith. Lord Dervan is expecting to see you for dinner, said Brolin. He wore the same heavy fabric as the city's citizens, thick and colourful tunics held tightly by a wide belt. By themselves, speakers gathered little attention, but 2 was enough to turn heads. Just as Luron and Brolin followed Bora, the crowd would point at the man. When they saw their cardinal symbol, tiny but embedded on their cloak, they would whisper their title.
Where is your apprentice?
Luron had to ask, because apprentices had to stay close until they passed their trials. Wera is back home in Morothan, he answered. Her mother has been sick for some time, so she requested to be with her. Brolin's apprentice was a red-haired dwarven girl with deep green eyes. If Luron recalled, she was no older than 8 years old. I could not object to her request, for I fear Lady Fee will not last.
We could delay our meeting for another time, said Luron.
No, I came because I hate good pies. Brolin scratched his grey beard before placing his pipe on his lips. Lady Fee knows that. He and Luron stopped because Bora tried on one of the handmade scarves. I prepared a room next to mine at one of the best inns you can imagine, the Hill, courtesy of Lord Dervin, of course, so don't forget to thank him. The mention gave Luron a bright idea. He gave the Danoni to Brolin, who was most confused. Now just wait a second, he stammered by Rith's grip on his beard. I am no babysitter. Before walking away, Luron pointed at Bora. Keep an eye on her, she's trouble. The weather was warm, and the salty air of the Alnair Sea refreshed his lungs. It was named after the brightest star in the southern constellation of Grus. After passing several shops, Luron stopped at a women's shop. Bora still wore the same vampire cloak and grey dress. She was skilled in sewing and made it last the journey. The dress he didn't mind, but the cloak caught a few eyes in the shanty towns. Inside, a heavy-set woman with long braided hair greeted him. What can I do for you, my lord?
I need a cloak for a woman yay height.
Luron stopped his hand at his chest, where he once pressed Bora's head. It was the night before they arrived at Isle Dervin. She was in tears, afraid of the day they were to part from one another. What colour is her skin? The shopkeeper asked.
Light, a tad shade of brown.
Olive skin?
Aye,
he said, feeling his cheeks grow hot. The woman brought 4 cloaks and laid them on the table. The shades ranged from light to dark. Not being a man of fashion, he chose the cold dark blue. Luron observed the many dresses, wondering what would look best before Lord Dervin. May I ask the colour of her hair? The savvy shopkeeper said.
Brown, answered Luron, a lighter shade than mine.
Chestnut, walnut, cinnamon? Who cared what shade of brown she had, and why did that have any importance to the colour she wore? Lacking his response, the shopkeeper presented a deep maroon dress to contrast the dark blue cloak. It wasn't a delicate dress like the noblewomen. At the low-cut neck was a spiral of gold stitching. Dwarves really loved to adorn their garments with heavy needlework. By the look on your face, speaker, this is the dress. Luron agreed.
Can you wrap my items and deliver them to the Hill? Should it arrive in my absence and a human woman receives it, tell your sender it was an anonymous gift.
Of course, smiled the shopkeeper. Bora fluttered her eyes open, not realising she had fallen asleep. She'd never slept on a bed that could hug her like the one at the Hill. She told Luron she would shut her eyes for a minute, not realising how much the marketplace tired her. At the corner of the bed was a neatly folded blue cloak with brown stitching at the hems. Beside it was a maroon-coloured dress with a tan belt and gold-coloured buckle. When she brushed her hands against the thick cloth, she held her breath. Luron and Rith were not with her. Thinking they had left her with a parting gift, she laughed. Across was the room Brolin stayed in. She banged on it, not caring how inappropriate it was to the other guests. Panting, she looked down the corridor, hoping to find Luron show up and greet her. The door opened. "Miss Bora," said the dwarf. "Luron, Rith," she uttered. "Where are they?" "Rith is with me." The speaker left the door open and brought the sleeping, chubby-cheeked prince. "I don't know why you two think I, a dwarf, am fit to babysit a Danoni." The moment Bora carried Rith, half of her heart was light again. "And Luron? Where is he?" "He's having dinner with Lord Dervin. You'll see him tomorrow morning. Let's hope you give him a good impression. A dwarf's kitchen is a demanding place." Brolin stopped to look at her tattered grey dress. "I thought Luron bought you new clothes." Bora couldn't hide her smile. Though he never mentioned it, she should have known that it couldn't be him, though she half thought it. Luron was resistant when it came to sharing his feelings. If she knew he felt something for her, it was the way he held her in bed. Hoping the dwarf wouldn't see her flushed cheeks, she thanked him for watching Rith. "Aye, not a problem," sighed Brolin, looking at his ruined tunic where a stain darkened his fabric. "Forgive me, but I must change out of these clothes. That laddie is a masterful marksman." Bora barely took a bite. A colourful arrangement of steamed vegetables decorated the silver plate. The juices of the broiled meat almost poured over in silky gravy. Underneath the dining table, she bounced one leg, hoping she looked presentable before Lord Dervan. She couldn't find the divide between his blonde hair and beard. His green tunic brought out his blue eyes, and his gold rings looked like they were fighting for space. The dining table was just as long as King Yosel's palace. Luron and Brolin were across, eating without a nerve on their faces. Because of them, her humble status was overlooked, and she was allowed to join them for dinner, with Rith in the care of a nursemaid. She tried not to fidget or ask what he was doing. Not having him near her hips exposed her marine dress that Luron seemed keen to stare at. Lord Dervan chewed a slice of fresh smoked pork, while Brolin updated him on the health of Lady Faye. The news wasn't good. The Duke stopped chewing and looked across, where a Duchess should have sat across him. His attention unexpectedly moved to Bora, forcing her back to straighten.
"Miss Bora,"
he said with raised eyebrows,
"is something wrong with our food?"
Bora looked down, seeing she barely touched it. "No, my lord, the food is good." She took a bite of the pork and chewed like he did before his gaze saddened.
"How is the meat?" he continued. "Anything you would change to improve the taste?"
"Nothing." Whoever seasoned the meat was indeed a talented cook, but perhaps the question was a test. What could be added to make an already pleasant dish taste better? She didn't want to think of Talonarch, yet her mind raced to their kitchens and their yams, their sweet yams. "Perhaps some yam syrup to balance the salt," she answered. Lord Dervan looked at his pork. Smiling, he sank his teeth on the meat and nodded. Since she learned the Duke lost his wife during childbirth, she expected him to appear in a not-so-hospitable mood. He already expressed he was unsure about Luron living in the Cyan Mountains. Brolin assured him Luron could rid them of the goblins that roamed their southern border. Neither mentioned Talonarch nor where she and Rith came from.
"Can you answer me something?"
Lord Dervan strayed from the formal titles and went back to his dish.
"King Yosel sent every sovereign land a letter asking for the whereabouts of a human maiden."
Luron and Bora locked eyes. Brolin cleared his throat. He was probably unsure of how he could get them out of the question. Lord Dervan ate, while they no longer found their food appealing. Finally, Luron stood from his seat and gave the Duke a bow.
"Thank you for your hospitality, but we will take our leave. Bora, come on." "I'm asking her a question,"
ordered Lord Dervan, who peered at Bora.
"How did you make it out of Talonarch?"
Bora gulped what remained of her wine so she could meet the blue eyes that darted at her. The Duke wanted her to be honest. How could she think to work in his kitchen and feed his table with lies? "I went through Graven Spruce Forest."
"On your own?"
he asked.
"Certainly, there is some connection with you and that Denoni you had at your hips."
Bora hesitantly looked at Luron. His stare told her to keep Rith out of it, but they were already at the Duke's mercy. "You are not mistaken." Lord Dervan sank his teeth into his loaf of bread and drank his wine. Chewing, his eyebrows squeezed, perhaps thinking with every bite he made. Luron power-walked to go around the luxurious table to get to Bora's side. He took her hand like she was a princess and helped her puzzled body out of the chair. Lord Dervan motioned his hand for Luron to sit down. The speaker couldn't get out of this one. He sat Bora down and returned to his seat.
"I know why you kept it from me."
Lord Dervan swirled a boiled carrot in gravy before he placed it in his mouth.
"King Yosel is not one to be crossed, but you're underestimating him, especially me. Several of my spies in this city reported Bora's cloak. You shouldn't have her travel so far, bearing the sewing skills of a Denoni."
He gulped his goblet empty and exhaled.
"It will make hiding her ever more difficult."
Bora couldn't hold her smile. She stumbled out of her seat and went to her knees. In Talanark, there was only one way she was taught how to bow to a noble. Facing Lord Dervan, she spread her palms open and bowed until her forehead touched the ground and her palms remained upright. "I don't deserve your mercy," she breathed to the marble floor. When she rose, Brolin leaned against his chair with crossed arms and a wide smile. Lord Dervan swept his hand up so she could rise.
"I don't give a rat's ass what King Yosel wants. This is my land, and I choose whom I keep and kick."
His gaze shifted at what remained of his meat.
"I hope to taste that jam syrup when you join the kitchen."
He then grinned at the speaker.
"As for you, are you jealous?"
"My lord?" he said, blinking by the sudden comment. Lord Dervan released a cackle and pointed at Bora.
"You looked at me like I would eat her up."
Brolin snorted and joined in, leaving Bora staring at Luron with flushed cheeks. "About my stay," Luron tried to say.
"My son is not yet 2 months old. You will find that I can sympathise with the young lad," said Lord Dervan. "When do you leave for the mountains?"
"In 3 months." Luron averted his gaze from her when he said it. "Brolin offered to stay and help me build a cabin, but I can't keep him forever."
"Very well,"
said Lord Dervan. Bora couldn't enjoy the rest of the feast, not when Luron and Rith were leaving soon. She tried to hide her frown and studied his expressions, but she wasn't an expert like Lord Dervan, nor could she read the speaker's mind. What did he think about them parting? Lord Dervan's palace kitchen was bigger than her village home. Cold storage held various meat, and others were for pickled vegetables. Any task the head cook gave her, she did with a smile. If she looked over her shoulder, she found Rith tied to her back, fast asleep by her rocking movements. This was the first time since she was taken from her village that she felt safe. No longer in Talanark, no longer travelling from town to town and from wilderness to wilderness. After 3 months had passed, Luron and Brolin returned from the Cyan Mountains. They came looking tired and in need of a good wash and a change of clothes. Some of their leather armour had to be replaced. The mountain goblins who didn't like their new neighbours challenged them. When Bora saw Luron, she wanted to embrace him, but she held back, wondering if any affection would make it difficult to see him go again. Her room was in the servants' quarters, inside Lord Dervan's palace. The day before they left for the Cyan Mountains, Bora spent the entire day with the prince. Rith learned to take a few confident steps, but if he fell, he would cry. Before bed, he clapped his hands to imitate Bora, who sang a folk song the dwarven women in the kitchen sang. On their last night together, she stayed at the hill. The late hour carried, and she couldn't sleep. Brolin and Luron had spent 3 months together, and yet they were busy, answering to small tasks for Lord Dervan. She wanted to go to the Cyan Mountains with Luron, but he was against it. When the door knocked, she opened it. Luron walked in with downcast eyes. He took off his cloak and sat on the chair. He exhaled and wiped from his face what looked like bits of blood. His eyes momentarily looked at the bed, where Rith slept, then back to the floor. "I don't want to part with you two," she said. He shut his eyes, as if he had braced himself for her to bring the conversation again. "The mountains are a day away. Rith and I can visit when we have the time. But listen to me, Bora. It isn't so much that speakers live dangerous lives at home, but that Rith will make it unsafe. My hands are tied, and the Secondborn must learn to become independent." He sighed when he saw her disappointed face. "If you wanted to give him that chance, you said so boldly in Aroga. You must honour your words." Bora crossed her arms and glanced at Rith. The older he got, the more his rustic red hair did not differ from King Yosel's. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I just thought maybe it would work out." Luron carefully brought Rith from the bed and passed him for Bora to hold. She pressed his sleeping face to her lips and kissed his forehead. Her words were said loosely, not knowing they would hurt. She was unaware until she heard it with her ears.
"Are you ending us?"
Luron struggled to say.
"It wouldn't be a bad idea. It would be safer if you never saw us."
Surprised by his words, Bora observed how serious, yet afraid his gaze was directed at her. "I didn't mean it like that," she said with a warm smile. "I meant being around you and Rith every day."
Luron exhaled his relief.
"We will visit as often and as safely as I can spare."
"That's not it." Her thoughts returned to her father, where she felt his fate blended as her own. "I lost my family once. I don't want to lose this one." The speaker looked at the chubby-cheeked baby and back at her. His mind was racing, but she didn't know what was on it. His lips were pressed against one another. Then they parted, wanting to utter some words, but he couldn't say it. "I'm all ears," she said, waiting for him.
"You must know it is difficult for me to say this. My master had no partner. He always said love was a distraction."
He looked away, as if to look for his next words in the room's corner.
"In Aroga, I detested you for that bite. Before you, carnal lust was how I learned to fill any lack of warmth, but it always ran empty."
His cheeks brimmed red when his gaze moved back to her.
"Bora, you were a waterfall."
As their lips drew near each other, the pound of a knock moved them back. It was unlocked, so Brolin opened it, bearing witness to their closeness. Their chests would have merged if the Secondborn was not between them.
"They should have known you two were more than companions."
Brolin took the pipe from his mouth and chuckled.
"I lost my bet against now. Mind your own business, old man, and give me a moment's peace."
Luron gave him the prince and shut the door. He turned, almost panting. He took her shoulders and parted his mouth.
"Bora,"
he said sternly. "Yes?" This was it. This was the moment she waited for, to hear Luron open his heart and tell her what he felt.
"Blasted,"
he said instead. Bora didn't feel any disappointment. His heart was mute, but his actions drummed louder than any beat she had heard. The scars on his body told her he had experienced enough pain. Suddenly, he startled her when he lifted her from the ground. She burned when he let his body tell her how he felt. Witches and wizards serve the mainlands under the Order, a school for sensitives to harness their stellar abilities and earn a living. But many do not attend for these reasons. Many want to escape the stigma humans with magical abilities possess. Chapter 10. Intolerance. 10 years later. "Your Majesty," Queen Sarita's voice echoed before she entered the throne room. Behind, a young boy followed her, with his attention focused on his feet. "Inari, look up and straighten your spine." Inari did as she asked. His hair was just like King Yosel, and his eyes were like hers. When they reached the seat of the throne, she smiled at her husband, whose stare no longer warmed for her. He was dressed in a black tunic and loose pants. His high collar had the red stitching of a dragon. "Prince Inari has taken a liking to archery," she said, shifting her gaze to the boy. "Isn't that right, my son?" The prince nodded with pressed lips. In his hand was his bow, as if to show his father it was not a tall tale. The bowyer had to make several for his height, each time increasing the draw weight when Inari said they felt light. The guards at the entrance set a wooden target with 6 inches of width. Queen Sarita stepped out of the way and nodded to her son. Inari drew the string and aimed. Holding his breath, he released. King Yosel rose from his seat. The arrow didn't hit the bullseye. It ploughed through the wood, leaving the fletching out. Despite King Yosel's smile, the prince rushed to him, went to one knee, and bowed. "Father, I missed," he said with a low bow.
Forgive me.
Never mind that. You have displayed the royal strength that was given to us by Nari's blessing.
He sat back down.
Precision in marksmanship is for the years ahead.
His eyes went to his queen and back to his son.
Leave us, Inari. I must speak to your mother.
Queen Sarita went to her knees and waited for her son to pass her. When the high ceilings no longer echoed his steps, she looked up at her king. She knew what the conversation would entail, and she hated having these private conversations. In public, King Yosel treated her like a deserving queen, but he was different when they were alone. Since she gave birth to his son, he no longer called her to his chamber. Just how many noble women have flung their arms at him at their parties? How many have kept his bed warm?
A reliable source reported that you are sending Lord Demlo's knights to search for the Secondborn.
That is true, my lord. Queen Sarita held back her growl. Who dared spy on her?
Be careful not to make a mistake, he said. You do not know how many eyes are watching the mainlands, how easily our enemies could use that Secondborn against us.
I wouldn't dare risk a mistake.
Good. You may leave.
Queen Sarita bowed. Yes, my lord. She wished she could send 100, but she always sent 2 hunters at a time. She went to her feet, but was stopped by her husband. His cold eyes beamed red.
Don't punish my son for missing the target,
he warned. Yes, my lord. Instead of looking for her son, whom she wanted to discipline for not hitting the bullseye, she went to her chamber. The handmaidens who followed to tend her were dismissed. In her solace, she slammed her fist against the wall. Her bones stung and pulsated, but she hit her fist once more and another time until her knuckles bled. The act was how her father vented his anger, and now she practiced it to relieve her own. The pulsating pain calmed her, and the blood on the wall helped her remember. Damn him! She hated the thought of King Yosel bringing another woman to his chamber, of his tolerance of the Secondborn living for another day. Damn that human girl! Because of her, a knight died simply because her husband did not approve of them having their way with the slaves. She shivered with rage that King Yosel could kill his own knight and bear no compassion for her high court maidens. With tears tarnishing her face, Queen Sarita scrubbed them with her nails. She barely caught a glimpse when he was born, but she cursed him every night. Damn you, Secondborn. This was The Secondborn by Miriam Yvette, narrated by Matthew Taylor. Copyright 2021 by Miriam Yvette. The end.